Marcel Proust. Marcel Proust was born in the Parisian suburb of Tulle on July 10, 1871. His father, Adrien Proust, was a doctor celebrated for his work in epidemiology. His mother, Jean Weil, was a stockbroker's daughter of Jewish descent. He lived as a child in the family home on Boulevard Malesherbes in Paris, but spent vacations with his aunt and uncle in the town of Villiers near Chartres, where the Prousts had lived for generations, and which became the model for the Combray of his great novel. Recent years it was officially renamed Villiers Combray, sickly from birth. Marcel was subject from the age of 9 to violent attacks of asthma. Although he did a year of military service as a young man and studied law and political science, his invalidism disqualified him from an active professional life. During the 1890s, Proust contributed sketches to Le Figaro and to a short-lived magazine, A Banquet, founded by some of his school friends. In 1892, Pleasures and Days, a collection of his stories, essays, and poems, was published in 1896. In his youth, Proust led an active social life, penetrating the highest circles of wealth and aristocracy, and intellectually, his influences include the aesthetic criticism of John Ruskin, the philosophy of Henry Bergson, the music of Wagner, and the diction of Anatole France, on whom he modeled his character Bergatta. An affair begun in 1894 with the composer and pianist Reynaldo Hahn marked the beginning of Proust's often anguished acknowledgement of his homosexuality. Following the publication of Émile Zola's letter in defense of Colonel Dreyfus in 1898, Proust became the first Dreyfuster, as he later phrased it. By the time Dreyfus was finally vindicated of charges of treason, Proust's social circles had been torn apart by the anti-Semitism and political hatred stirred up by the affair. Proust was very attached to his mother, and after her death in 1905 he spent some time in a sanatorium. His health worsened progressively, and he withdrew almost completely from society and devoted himself to writing. Proust's early work had done nothing to establish his reputation as a major writer. In an unfinished novel, Jean Santuel, not published until 1952, he laid some of the groundwork for In Search of Lost Time, and in Against Saint-Guve, written in 1908-9. He stated as his aesthetic credo, a book is the product of a different self from the one we manifest in our habits, in society, in our vices. If we mean to try to understand this self, it is only in our inmost depths, by endeavoring to reconstruct it there, that the quest can be achieved. He appears to have begun work on his long masterpiece sometime around 1908, and the first volume, Swan's Way, was published in 1913. In 1919, the second volume, Within a Budding Grove, won the Goncourt Prize, bringing Proust great and instantaneous fame to subsequent sections of the Grammont Way. 1920-21 on Sodom and Gomorrah. 1921 appeared in his lifetime of the depiction of homosexuality in the latter. His friend André Gide complained, "Oh, will you never portray this form of eros for us?" In the aspect of youth and beauty, the remaining volumes were published following Proust's death on November 18, 1922, The Captive in 1923, The Fugitive in 1925, and Time Regained in 1927. An introduction. Richard Howard. In old days, books were written by men of letters and read by the public. Nowadays, books are written by the public and read by nobody. Dear Proust, I'd like you to meet your readers. Most of them have heard about you for some time. There have been at least 4 films made of In Search of Lost Time. There has even been a film about you and your housekeeper and your asthma and your cork-lined room. Of a film, of course, about the inaccessible last years of your life. And certainly they have had many opportunities to get acquainted with your great work. Everyone has been told it is great, but for one reason or another they haven't, and so why not you like to know? Well, to begin with, your reputation as a difficult author is widespread, and many readers are daunted. For instance, you're said to have written the longest sentence in the history of literature. There's even a parlor game that challenges people to diagram it, and of course the search itself is one of the longest novels in modern literature, along and intricate and elusive. Why? There are even some critics who, you know how we are all intimidated by critics who say it isn't a novel at all. What do they say it is? Oh, a cultural cosmogonian, a many-penny satire, and most overwhelming of all, a sort of evangel. For you offer us the postulation that we can, in the shadow, or rather the radiance, of your own entreaty, go and do likewise. Each reader, instructed and inspired by your own salvationist exercises, has a capacity to redeem his own past, to regain the time I myself have, or have had. To friends, Jean Stafford and Roland Barthes, they're both dead now. felt your book was more like a gospel than a novel, being used to say she had to start your book over every 5 years because each time she read you she had already become a different person. And Roland, near the end of his own life in 1978, wrote that he, like Proust, threatened by death or believing himself, so it came back to the phrase of St. John which Proust quotes in Contra Saint work. While you still have the light, know it will be possible still to call a novel the work which I desire to write, in which I expect to break with the nature of my previous writings. It is important for me to act as if I were to write this utopian novel, to put myself in the position of the subject who makes something, and no longer of the subject who speaks about something. It is of more than incidental interest, with regard to the search as this sort of gospel and prototype, that Roland Barthes found himself qualified to make certain reservations, certain criticisms, which do not alter his soterial purpose. He readily acknowledged that he preferred certain parts of the search to others, but that each time he read the book again, the parts he then preferred were different ones, and that was why Proust was a great writer. But the real trouble new readers have with your book is reading it for the first time, and most of that trouble, frankly, is the length of what you call long words. Now, if you get to know each other a little, there are ways of solving this problem. For instance, one could moderate the academic insistence that a reading of Proust has to be conducted straight through, from beginning to end, no dipping here and there, no looking ahead or back. There's no need to stipulate such draconian conditions for achieving some sort of intimacy with you. That's why I am so eager to introduce you to your new readers. But for now, let me say that in introducing them to you, I want you to understand that there might be some problems, what appear to be contemporary problems, such as, American readers are likely to be in a hurry if they haven't time. They often say, it's an expression you might appreciate, and you will have to admit you're a very deliberate writer. You need to be patient with your American readers, actually. I think you've already devised a technique for patience, at least for their patience. Notice that often on any one page or in any one passage or somewhere between a chant and a chapter you manage to cast your spell, to sound your note, to tell your truth, for goodness sake, so that readers don't have to read all the way to the end of the whole book to get what Proust is about. You seeing to it that the message is sent on every page. Readers can read and stop, and then another time resume. There are other books like that, we call them wisdom literature, and their matter is casually crystallized quite as often as it is likely to be exhaustively secreted. Of course, I think there's a real advantage in building up sufficient momentum to read straight through from. For a long time I would go to bed early to a 6 volumes on between which so many days have come to range themselves in time. But say you had provided or permitted a way of reading your book which took our new readers' impatience into consideration, which summed up as they went along. Even that kind of epitomizing might well strike your new readers as a sort of jungle, a sort of maze. You remember all those comparisons critics have made of the search to Gothic cathedral, or a Wagner opera, or even a flying carpet. You're not generally considered pithy, yet all through the tangled volumes of your work, you do crystallize the world into aphorisms and epigrams. I think you're as succinct as any of those classic French moralists politely murmuring somewhere behind you, while sometimes you're faster than La Rochefoucauld himself, as when you say, it's from adolescents who last long enough that life makes its old men out. If I could admonish your new readers to watch out for those moments of speed, as it were, among the prolonged dimensions and the plethoric details, I think they would find the going a lot easier than they'd expected. But all I want to do for now is to make sure that in meeting your new readers you know what to expect of them, what you have to come to terms with, as I hope to tell them what to expect of you, and what they have to come to terms with when they start reading The Search. Oh, there is one more thing you ought to be aware of if you're going to confront these new readers of yours with a modicum of goodwill, even though you manage to include, with a really Tolstoyan appetite, such modern manifestations as the Great War and airplanes. Telephone's a wonderful what you did with them, new American readers in the 21st century. The time you keep referring to as lost, but in French lost means wasted as well as over and done with, of no account, and a search for the past, even one recent enough to include automobiles and airplanes, is an unlikely, even an ineluctable enterprise. You see, we have a kind of allergy to the past. It's our national disease. And the very assurance with which you insist that the past is within the present is likely to seem quite repellent, even offensive, to these new readers. I know you intend to be gentle with them, your ferocity is elsewhere, but I feel I must warn you about the reception you're likely to meet when you release one of your zingers on the subject. Will take the American readers of the 21st century along frequentation of themselves as well as of you to believe it when you say, it's no use trying to evoke our past. All the efforts of our intelligence are futile. The past lies hidden beyond the mind's realm and reach, in some material object, in the sensation that material object gives us and it depends entirely on chance whether or not we encounter that object before we die. Finally, what your new readers will want to know is who's saying such a thing, who tells it like it is, who's the discoursing person, and these questions bring me to the other part of my project, introducing your new readers to you, Proust. You'll notice to your new readers that I haven't said introducing person speaks in the search at all. You'll find that the discoursing person, who is in fact the narrator of the search, is hardly ever named, and if indeed he seems to be called Marcel once or twice, it's extremely difficult to assign him the attributes of autobiography. He is the self who writes, and his relations with the self who votes and pays rent and has bad or good sex are uncertain and in some sense displaced. Proust himself has explained this neatly when he insists that Saint-Beuve, for example, fails to realize that a book is the product of a different self from the one we manifest in our habits, in society, in our vices. In other words, it is futile to wonder if the narrator of the search is the Marcel Proust so many people remembered knowing after the book was published, and even before the narrator is simply another Proust, quite frequently unrecognized by the author. In fact, Marcel Proust couldn't recognize the narrator, since this other Proust is created by what is written, not by the author's intention to write. For the Proust I want to introduce is a new and odd modern kind of narrator. I'll try to explain what I mean by modern in a little while, for if he does really narrate rather than philosophize or write what are now called personal essays, the narrative he writes will not apprehend a life perceived in a linear course of time, from year to year until the moment he decides to write the story down. What is narrated is not the narrator's life, but his desire to write. Time thwarts this desire, tends it toward a conventional chronology which must be continually subverted, for what is merely successive is surely lost. Only the circle can be retrieved, a word that means not only regained, but rediscovered, recognized, repossessed, and how many challenges, discouragements, and rivalries must be endured before the desire to write achieves an ultimate triumph. This is the best reason to read straight through to the end of Le Temps Retrouve, where the narrator arrives at the Gourmand's party and discovers what it is that he has to write. A time regained, and thereby realizes, indeed reassures himself, that he will be able to write, though as we all like to discover when we close the last volume, it is already written. So the reader learns that what the search contains is indeed the narrator's life, but a life displaced. As I said, we've read a symbolic biography, or as one of Marcel Proust's early biographers of I Now There Have Been So Many calls it, a symbolic story of Proust's life. In one of his prophetic letters, Keats wrote a man's life of any worth is a continual allegory, and Keats seemed quite certain, actually quite sanguine, about the legibility of the allegory. It was plain and pleasing to such a poet, but Proust's favorite poet, Charles Baudelaire, had been more doubtful, more pessimistic, in fact more tragic about reading the sense of the allegory out of the given life experience. As if in a shroud, my heart lay buried in this allegory. On Aphrodite's island all found was a token gallows where my image hung. Lord, give me strength and courage to behold my body and my heart without disgust. Of course Proust had the courage to behold anything in his or anyone else's body in its behaviors, but he was not so sure about what strength would be given him, or what strength remained of what had been given. And indeed, in terms of his health, it was a narrow squeak. Of Proust's textual revisions recovered in the last 25 years have shown us how much was left to do, how much could not quite be done. There is a whole other poetic drama maker's drama in the recently published notebooks, the variant readings, the cancelled but plausible versions of Marcel Proust's wavering Egan about where to place this humiliation, that death, though their sudden revelation of, for instance, the discovery that the two ways are the same. Indeed, whole sections were wrested from what in linear terms would be their right place in order to serve the design, to fulfill the allegory. And Proust scholarship for the next 25 years will be instructing our undergraduate student as to what some of the decisions and the indecisions had been and what they became, more or less. Finally, certainly the requirements of the logic of the allegory allowed, actually compelled, Proust to erase the differences, the contradictions between the novel and the discourse, as Descartes would have it, the treatise, as Spinoza, the essay as Montaigne. This recognition brings us to the figure of Proust as a modern writer, which any introduction to the 20th century's greatest novelist must engage, because Proust was 29 when he entered that century, in which he lived only 22 years. Indeed, he was 35 and had already written several unsuccessful versions of The Search. Before 1907, Tolstoy was 30 when he completed his great autobiographical allegory Childhood, Boyhood, and Youth, and began his career as a novelist. We call Tolstoy the greatest novelist of the 19th century, though he lived a decade into the 20th, and though the essays that finish off War and Peace are written in the year Proust was born seem obstructively modern on our first reading of that novel. Still, we do not regard Tolstoy as a modern novelist. Yet Proust, who is as insistent about the realism of the world of The Search as anything in Anna Karenina, as inclusive about its naturalism as everything in The Death of Ivan Ilyich, is inveterately coupled or tripled on by Nabokov, for example, with Joyce and Beeley and Kafka, as indefectibly modern. That narrator and his strangely absent presence, if I may put it that way. Proust's every gigantic effort is to subtract his narrator's discovery and possession of time regained from what Gaston Bachelard calls the false permanence of biography. That is what pushes this enormous novel over the edge of encyclopedic illusion, of social chronicle, of literary emulation, of symbolist dithering, speculations concerning love, art, death, and time into that enormous structure abyss of reputations which is our modernity. This matter of locating Proust in such modernity is the most vexed question with which you must contend. For Proust is a writer between two centuries, between two aesthetic postulations of the realism of Balzac, Flaubert, Goncourt, etc., and the symbolism of Baudelaire, Huysmans, Mallarmé, etc., or, as Antoine Compiègne, the best critic of Proust between centuries, puts it, between etymology and allegory. Proust can be perceived as epitomizing the past achievements, but he can also be characterized as inaugurating new ones. His suspension between the fictional obligations of 19th century masterpieces and those of 20th century experiments makes it difficult for his new readers to be comfortably aware of what he is doing. He seems on the one hand to be violating the laws or at least the conventions of an achieved program, and on the other hand to be regressing from explorations and discoveries into the tried and true, or at least the old, reliable methods of a familiar agenda. I believe my introducing you to each other will be more convincing if I offer this notion of reputations, of negativism, as the essential modernism of this great writer, for in the making of his gospel novel, his Fictiones Evangel, Proust rejects, one after the other, precisely those realms of experience that have heretofore always constituted the claims of human success and the triumphs of worldliness, of friendship, and of love, all of which Proust declares to be failures, in fact disasters. It is only art, or rather the mediations to be found in art, that Proust urges as the means of regaining time, of recovering what is otherwise and always lost. That is why he elevates to a special eminence in The Search for characters Nelster, Vinteuil, Bergot, and Burma painter, composer, writer, and actress, or artists whose creations point the way to redemption, or the empty fifth character, the narrator, who in several thousand pages reveals so few hints about his physical appearance that it is impossible to imagine what sort of man he is. He is frail and suffers from asthma and insomnia. We know that much, but all his other energies and perceptions are directed, under the pressure of the most exhaustive observation, to the acknowledgement that the human enterprise in society, in friendship, and in love is a failure, the source of exhaustion, ruin, and despair. The other 35 or 40 or 50 characters who accompany us through The Search, like so many grand and grotesque catastrophes, even Charles, even the Duchess of Gramont, even the narrator's grandmother, whose name we never learn, are relegated to tragedy or to farce with the same dismissive gesture by which Wotan repudiates Hunding and Dawakir after he has killed Siegmund with a wave of his hand. The god casts at the mortal who has served his pathetic turn. Only the artist, or rather only what the artist creates, is triumphant, is exemplary, is enduring, is successful, and only such makings can persuade the narrator to undertake one of his own persuasion, in which over 3,000 pages or so we must collude. His language, a Proust language, of course surrounds us, penetrates us, so that these makings are not only the narrator's redemptive moments but our own. It is my fervent hope that by introducing, with some charity, you new readers to Proust, and by introducing, with an equivalent charity, Proust to his new readers, the parties may proceed some way together. Emblematic fulfillment of this hope, I am somewhat encouraged by the new street signs of Paris boulevards, which as if they sought to celebrate. The Proustian suggests that asserts we are like giants plunged in time. Flash a message picked out in little red lights for danger for delectation to those seeking safe passage to the median strip between opposing directions of traffic, a haven that must be attained before reaching the seemingly inaccessible other side of traversiers in due temps. The red lights direct us cross over time and time again. Richard Howard is a poet and translator. He teaches literature in the writing division of Columbia University's School of the Arts. A note on the translation. A 1981 Terence Colmartin C.K. Scott Moncrief's version of a La Recherche du Temps perdu has in the past 50 years earned a reputation as one of the great English translations, almost as a masterpiece in its own right. Why then should it need revision or tamper with a work that has been enjoyed and admired, not to say revered, by several generations of readers throughout the English-speaking world? The answer is that the original French edition from which Scott Moncrief worked, the abominable edition of the Nouvelle Revue Française, as Samuel Beckett described it in a marvelous short study of Proust which he published in 1931, it was notoriously imperfect. This was not so much the fault of the publishers and printers as of Proust's methods of composition. Only the first volume in Côte de Chez Swann of the novel as originally conceived and indeed written was published before the 1914-1918 war. The second volume was set up in type, but publication was delayed, and moreover by that time Proust had already begun to reconsider the scale of the novel. Of the remaining 8 years of his life, 1914-1922, were spent in expanding it from its original 500,000 words to more than 1.25 million. The margins of proofs and type pictures were covered with scribbled corrections and insertions, often overflowing onto additional sheets which were glued to the galleys or to one another to form interminable strips of what Françoise in the novel calls the narrator's paperals. The unraveling and deciphering of these copious editions cannot have been an enviable task for editors and printers. Furthermore, the last 3 sections of the novel Le Prisonnier Fugitive, originally called Albertine Desbrieux and Le Temps Retrouvé, had not yet been published at the time of Proust's death in November 1922. He was still correcting a typed copy of Le Prisonnier on his deathbed. Here the original editors had to take it upon themselves to prepare a coherent text from a manuscript littered with sometimes hasty corrections, revisions, and afterthoughts, leaving a number of unresolved contradictions, obscurities, and chronological inconsistencies. As a result of all this, the original editions, even of the volumes published in Proust's lifetime, are polite with errors, misreadings, and omissions. In 1954, a revised 3-volume edition of a La Recherche was published in Gallimard's Bibliothèque de la Plède. The editors M. Pierre Claret and M. André Fair had been charged by Proust's heirs with the task of establishing a text of his novel as faithful as possible to his intentions. With infinite care and patience they examined all the relevant material, the manuscripts, notebooks, type pictures, proofs, as well as the original edition, and produced what is generally agreed to be a virtually impeccable transcription of Proust's text. They scrupulously avoided the arbitrary emendations, the touchings up, wholesale reshufflings of paragraphs in which the original editors indulged, confining themselves to clarifying the text wherever necessary, correcting errors due to haste or inadvertence, eliminating careless repetitions and rationalizations, the punctuation on area where Proust was notoriously casual. They justify and explain their editorial decisions in detailed critical notes, occupying some 200 pages over the 3 volumes, and print all the significant variants as well as a number of passages that Proust did not have time to work into his book. The Plède text differs from that of the original edition, mostly in minor though nonetheless significant ways. Throughout the novel, the last 3 sections, a third Plède volume, of the differences are sometimes considerable. In particular, Claret and Fair have included a number of passages, sometimes of a paragraph or 2, sometimes of several pages, which the original editors omitted for no good reason. The present translation is a reworking, on the basis of the Plède edition, of Scott Moncrief's version of the first 6 sections of a La Recherche, or the first 11 volumes of the 12-volume English edition, a post-Plède version of the final volume, Le Temps Retrouvé, originally translated by Stephen Hudson after Scott Moncrief's death in 1930, was produced by the late Andreas Mayer and published in 1970, with some minor emendations, It is incorporated in this edition, being no indication in Proust's manuscript as to where La Fugitive should and in L'Attempts Retrouve begin. I have followed the Plaid editors in introducing the break some pages earlier than in the previous editions, both French and English at the beginning of the account of the Tansonville episode. The need to revise the existing translation in the light of the Plaid edition has also provided an opportunity of correcting mistakes and misinterpretations in Scott Moncrief's version. Translation, almost by definition, is imperfect. There is always room for improvement, and it is only too easy for the latecomer to assume the beau role. I have refrained from officious tinkering for its own sake, but a translator's loyalty is to the original author, and in trying to be faithful to Proust's meaning and tone of voice I have been obliged, here and there, to make extensive alterations. A general criticism that might be leveled against Scott Moncrief is that his prose tends to the purple and the precious war, that this is how he interpreted the tone of the original, whereas the truth is that complicated, dense, overloaded though it often is, Proust's style is essentially natural and unaffected, quite free of precisity, archaism, or self-conscious elegance. Another pervasive weakness of Scott Moncrief's is perhaps the defect of a virtue. A widely held view, he stuck very closely to the original. He is seldom guilty of shortcuts, omissions, or loose paraphrases, and in his efforts to reproduce the structure of those elaborate sentences with their spiraling subordinate clauses, not only does he sometimes lose the thread, but he wrenches his syntax into oddly English shapes. A whiff of Gallicism clings to some of the longer periods, obscuring the sense and falsifying the tone. Corollary to this is a tendency to translate French idioms in terms of phrase literally, thus making them sound weirder, more outlandish than they would to a French reader. In endeavoring to rectify these weaknesses, I hope I have preserved the noted felicity of much of Scott Moncrief while doing the fullest possible justice to Proust. I should like to thank Professor J. G. Whiteman for his generous help and advice, and Mr. D. J. Enright for his patient and percipient editing. A note on the revised translation in 1992. D. J. Enright. Terence Kilmartin intended to make further changes to the translation as published in 1981 under the title Remembrance of Things Past, but as Proust's narrator observed while reflecting on the work he had yet to do, when the fortress of the body is besieged on all sides, the mind must at length succumb. It was precisely when the thought of death had become a matter of indifference to me that I was beginning once more to fear death as a threat not to myself but to my book. C. K. Scott Moncrief excelled in description, notably of landscape and architecture, but he was less adroit in translating dialogue of an informal, idiomatic nature, at ease with intellectual and artistic discourse and the finer feelings, and alert to sallies of humorous fantasy. He was not always comfortable with workaday matters in the less elevated aspects of human behavior. It was left to Kilmartin to elucidate the significance of Albertine's incomplete but alarming outburst of the fair Casser. Moncrief rendered totally incomprehensible, perhaps through squeamishness, perhaps through ignorance of low slang, misunderstandings of colloquialism, and failures to spot secondary meanings remained to be rectified, and some further intervention was prompted by Scott Moncrief's tendency to spell out things for the benefit of the English reader, an admirable intention shared by Arthur Whalley in his tale of Gengia, though the effect could be to clog Proust's flow and make his drift harder to follow. The present revision, or revision, has taken into account the second Plaid edition of A La Recherche du Temps Perdu, published in 4 volumes between 1987 and 1989 under the direction of Jean-Yves Taddy. This both adds, chiefly in the form of drafts and variants, and relicate material, and not always helpfully from the viewpoint of the common as distinct from specialist or reader, who may be surprised to encounter virtually the same passage in 2 different locations when there was doubt as to where Proust would finally have placed it. But the new edition clears up some long-standing misreadings of, for example, correcting Cambrammer's admiring niece in time regained to his mother, an identification which accords with a mention some 1,000 pages earlier in the novel. Kilmartin notes that it is only too easy for the latecomer, tempted to make his mark by officious tinkering, to assume the beau role. Caveat so delicately worded is one to take to heart. I am much indebted to my wife, Madeleine, without whose collaboration I would never have dared to assume a role that is melancholy rather than in any sense. So, Part 1. Combray. For a long time I would go to bed early, sometimes the candle barely out. My eyes closed so quickly that I did not have time to tell myself I'm falling asleep. And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to look for sleep would awaken me. I would make as if to put away the book which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I had gone on thinking, while I was asleep, about what I had just been reading, but these thoughts had taken a rather peculiar turn. It seemed to me that I myself was the immediate subject of my book. A church toward it, the rivalry between Françoise and Charles V. This impression would persist for some moments after I awoke. It did not offend my reason, but lay like scales upon my eyes and prevented them from registering the fact that the candle was no longer burning. Then it would begin to seem unintelligible, as the thoughts of a previous existence must be after reincarnation. Of the subject of my book would separate itself from me, leaving me free to apply myself to it or not, and at the same time my sight would return, and I would be astonished to find myself in a state of darkness, pleasant and restful enough for my eyes, but even more, perhaps, for my mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible, without a cause. Something dark indeed. I would ask myself what time it could be. I could hear the whistling of trains, which, now nearer and now further off, punctuating the distance, like the note of a bird in a forest, showed me in perspective the deserted countryside through which a traveler is hurrying towards the nearby station. On the path he is taking will be engraved in his memory by the excitement induced by strange surroundings, by unaccustomed activities, by the conversation he has had and the farewells exchanged beneath an unfamiliar lamp that still echo in his ears amid the silence of the night, and by the happy prospect of being home again. I would lay my cheeks gently against the comfortable cheeks of my pillow, as plump and fresh as the cheeks of childhood. I would strike a match to look at my watch. Nearly midnight. The hour when an invalid, who has been obliged to set out on a journey and to sleep in a strange hotel, awakened by a sudden spasm, sees with glad relief a streak of daylight showing under his door. Thank God, it is morning. The servants will be about in a minute. He can ring, and someone will come to look after him. The thought of being assuaged gives him strength to endure his pain. He is certain he heard footsteps, so they come nearer, and then die away. The ray of light beneath his door is extinguished. It is midnight. Someone has just turned down the gas, and the last servant has gone to bed, and he must lie all night suffering without remedy. I would fall asleep again, and thereafter would rewaken for short snatches only, just long enough to hear the regular creaking of the wainscot, or to open my eyes to stare at the shifting kaleidoscope of the darkness, to savor, in a momentary glimmer of consciousness, the sleep which lay heavy upon the furniture, the room, that whole of which I formed no more than a small part, and whose insensibility I should very soon return to share, or else while sleeping I had drifted back to an earlier stage in my life, now forever outgrown, and had come under the thrall of one of my childish terrors, such as that old terror of my great-uncle's pulling my curls, which was effectually dispelled on the day of the dawn of a new era to me, when they were finally cropped from my head. I had forgotten that event during my sleep, but I remembered it again immediately I had succeeded in waking myself up to escape my great-uncle's fingers, and as a measure of precaution I would bury the whole of my head in the pillow before returning to the world of dreams. Sometimes, too, as Eve was created from a rib of Adam, a woman would be born during my sleep from some misplacing of my thigh, conceived from the pleasure I was on the point of enjoying. She it was, I imagined, who offered me that pleasure. My body, conscious that its own warmth was permeating hers, would strive to become one with her, and I would awake. The rest of humanity seemed very remote in comparison with this woman whose company I had left but a moment ago. My cheek was still warm from her kiss. My body ached beneath the weight of hers. If, as would sometimes happen, she had the features of some woman whom I had known in waking hours, I would abandon myself altogether to this end, to find her again, like people who set out on a journey to see with their eyes some city of their desire, and imagine that one can taste in reality what has charmed one's fancy, and then, gradually, the memory of her would fade away. I had forgotten the girl of my dream. When a man is asleep, he has in a circle round him the chain of the hours, the sequence of the years, the order of the heavenly bodies. Instinctively he consults them when he awakes, and in an instant reads off his own position on the earth's surface and the time that has elapsed during his slumbers. But this ordered procession is apt to grow confused, and to break its ranks. Suppose that, towards morning, after a night of insomnia, sleep descends upon him while he is reading, in quite a different position from that in which he normally goes to sleep. he has only to lift his arm to rest the sun and turn it back in its course, and at the moment of waking, he will have no idea of the time, but will conclude that he has just gone to bed, or suppose that he dozes off in some even more abnormal and divergent position, sitting in an armchair. For instance, after dinner, then the world will go hurtling out of orbit. The magic chair will carry him at full speed through time and space, and when he opens his eyes again, he will imagine that he went to sleep months earlier in another place. But for me, it was enough if, in my own bed, my sleep was so heavy as completely to relax my consciousness afore. Then I lost all sense of the place in which I had gone to sleep, and when I awoke in the middle of the night, not knowing where I was, I could not even be sure at first who I was. I had only the most rudimentary sense of existence, such as may lurk and flicker in the depths of an animal's consciousness. I was more destitute than the cave dweller, but then the memory not yet of the place in which I was, but of various other places where I had lived and might now very possibly be, would come like a rope let down from heaven to draw me up out of the abyss of not being, from which I could never have escaped by myself. In a flash I would traverse centuries of civilization, and out of a blurred glimpse of oil lamps, then of shirts with turned down collars, would gradually piece together the original components of my ego. Perhaps that nobility of the things that surround us is forced upon them by our conviction that they are themselves and not anything else, by the nobility of our conception of them. For it always happened that when I awoke like this, and my mind struggled in an unsuccessful attempt to discover where I was, everything revolved around me through the darkness of things, places, years. My body, still too heavy with sleep to move, would endeavor to construe from the pattern of its tiredness the position of its various limbs, in order to deduce therefrom the direction of the wall, the location of the furniture, to piece together and give a name to the house in which it lay, its memory, the composite memory of its ribs, its knees, its shoulder blades, offered it a series of rooms in which it had at one time or another slept, walls unseen, walls shifting and adapting themselves to the shape of each successive room that it remembered, whirled round it in the dark, and even before my brain, hesitating at the threshold of times and shapes, had reassembled the circumstances sufficiently to identify the room, and my body would recall from each room in succession the style of the bed, the position of the doors, the angle at which the daylight came in at the windows, whether there was a passage outside, what I had had in my mind when I went to sleep and found there when I awoke. The stiffened side on which I lay would, for instance, in trying to fix its position, imagine itself to be lying face to the wall in a big bed with a canopy, and at once I would say to myself, why, I must have fallen asleep before Mamma came to say good night, for I was in the country at my grandfather's, who died years ago, and my body, the side upon which I was lying, faithful guardians of a past which my mind should never have forgotten, brought back before my eyes the glimmering flame of the night light in its urn-shaped bowl of bohemian glass that hung by chains from the ceiling, and the chimney-piece of Siena marble in my bedroom at Cambrai, in my grandparents' house, in those far distant days which, at this moment, I imagined to be in the present without being able to picture them exactly, and which would become plainer in a little while when I was properly awake. Then the memory of a new position would spring up, and the wall would slide away in another direction. I was in my room in Mme. St. Luke's house in the country. Good heavens, it must be 10 o'clock. They will have finished dinner. I must have overslept myself in the little nap which I always take when I come in from my walk with Mme. St. Luke, before dressing for the evening. For many years have now elapsed since the Cambrai days when, coming in from the longest and latest walks, I would still be in time to see the reflection of the sunset glowing in the panes of my bedroom window. It is a very different kind of life that one leads at Tansonville, at Mme. St. Luke's, and a different kind of pleasure that I derive from taking walks only in the evenings, from visiting by moonlight the roads on which I used to play as a child in the sunshine. As for the bedroom in which I must have fallen asleep instead of dressing for dinner, I can see it from the distance as we return from our walk, with its lamp shining through the window, a solitary beacon in the night. These shifting and confused gusts of memory never lasted for more than a few seconds. It often happened that, in my brief spell of uncertainty as to where I was, I did not distinguish the various suppositions of which it was composed any more than, when we watch a horse running, we isolate the successive positions of its body as they appear upon a bioscope. But I had seen first one and then another of the rooms in which I had slept during my life, and in the end I would revisit them all in the long course of my waking dream. Rooms in winter where, on going to bed, I would at once bury my head in a nest woven out of the most diverse materials of the corner of my pillow, the top of my blanket, a piece of a shawl, the edge of my bed, and a copy of a children's paper, all which I had contrived to cement together bird fashion by dint of continuous pressure, rooms where, in freezing weather, I would enjoy the satisfaction of being shut in from the outer world like the sea swallow which builds at the end of a dark tunnel and is kept warm by the surrounding earth, and where, the fire keeping in all night, I would sleep wrapped up, as it were, in a great cloak of snug and smoky air, shot with the glow of the logs intermittently breaking out again in flame. A sort of alcove without walls, a cave of warmth dug out of the heart of the room itself, a zone of heat whose boundaries were constantly shifting and altering in temperature as gusts of air traversed them to strike freshly upon my face from the corners of the room or from parts near the window or far from the fireplace, which had therefore remained cold. There were rooms in summer where I would delight to feel myself a part of the warm night, where the moonlight striking upon the half-open shutters would throw down to the foot of my bed its enchanted ladder, where I would fall asleep, as it might be in the open air, like a titmus witch. The breeze gently rocks at the tip of a sunbeam on, or sometimes the loose seavy room, so cheerful that I never felt miserable in it, even on my first night, and in which the slender columns that lightly supported its ceiling drew so gracefully apart to reveal and frame the sight of the bed. But sometimes, again, the little room with the high ceiling, hollowed in the form of a pyramid out of two separate stories, and partly walled with mahogany, and which from the first moment, mentally poisoned by the unfamiliar scent of vetiver, I was convinced of the hostility of the lilac curtains and of the insolent indifference of a clock that chattered on at the top of its voice as though I were not there, and which a strange and pitiless rectangular cheval glass standing across one corner of the room carved out for itself a side I had not looked to find tenanted in the soft planetide of my normal field of vision, and which my mind, striving 4 hours on and to break away from its moorings, to stretch upwards so as to take on the exact shape of the room and to reach to the topmost height of its gigantic funnel, had endured many a painful night as I lay stretched out in bed, my eyes staring upwards, my ears straining, my nostrils flaring, my heart beating on until habit had changed the color of the curtains, silenced the clock, brought an expression of pity to the cruel slanting face of the glass, disguised or even completely dispelled the scent of vetiver, and appreciably reduced the apparent loftiness of the ceiling, habit that skillful but slow-moving arranger who begins by letting our minds suffer for weeks on end in temporary quarters, but whom our minds are none the less only too happy to discover at last, for, without it, reduced to their own devices, they would be powerless to make any room seem habitable. Certainly I was now well awake, and my body had veered round for the last time, and the good angel of certainty had made all the surrounding objects stand still, had set me down under my bedclothes in my bedroom, and had fixed, approximately in their right places in the uncertain light, my chest of drawers, my writing table, my fireplace, the window overlooking the street, and both the doors. But for all that, I now knew that I was not in any of the houses of which the ignorance of the waking moment had, in a flash, if not presented me with a distinct picture, at least persuaded me of the possible presence. My memory had been set in motion. As a rule, I did not attempt to go to sleep again at once, but used to spend the greater part of the night recalling our life in the old days at Cambrai with my great-aunt at Balbec, Paris, Tansiers, Venice, and the rest, remembering again all the places and people I had known, what I had actually seen of them, and what others had told me. At Cambrai, as every afternoon ended long before the time when I should have to go to bed and lie there, and sleeping, far from my mother and grandmother, my bedroom became the fixed point on which my melancholy and anxious thoughts were centered. Someone had indeed had the happy idea of giving me, to distract me on evenings when I seemed abnormally wretched, a magic lantern, which used to be set on top of my lamp while we waited for dinner time to come on, after the fashion of the master builders and glass painters of Gothic days. It substituted for the opaqueens of my walls an impalpable iridescence, supernatural phenomena of many colors, in which legends were depicted as on a shifting and transitory window. But my sorrows were only increased thereby, because this mere change of lighting was enough to destroy the familiar impression I had of my room, thanks to which, save for the torture of going to bed, it had become quite endurable. I no longer recognized it, and felt uneasy in it as in a room in some hotel or chalet, in a place where I had just arrived by train for the first time. Riding at a jerky trot, Golo, filled with an infamous design, issued from the little triangular forest which softened with dark green the slope of a hill, and advanced fitfully towards the castle of poor Genevieve de Brabant. This castle was cut off short by a curved line which was in fact the circumference of one of the transparent ovals in the slides which were pushed into position through a slot in the lantern. It was only the wing of the castle, and in front of it stretched a moor on which Genevieve stood dreaming, wearing a blue girdle. The castle and the moor were yellow, but I could tell their color without waiting to see them, for before the slides made their appearance the old sonorous name of Brabant had given me an unmistakable clue. Golo stopped for a moment and listened sadly to the accompanying patter read aloud by my great-aunt, which he seemed perfectly to understand, for he modified his attitude with a docility not devoid of a degree of majesty, so as to conform to the indications given in the text. Then he rode away at the same jerky trot, and nothing could arrest his slow progress. If the lantern were moved, I could still distinguish Golo's horse advancing across the window curtains, swelling out with their curves and diving into their folds. The body of Golo himself, being of the same supernatural substance as his steeds, overcame every material obstacle of everything that seemed to bar his way over by taking it as an ossature and absorbing it into himself, even the doorknob on which, adapting themselves at once, his red cloak or his pale face, still as noble and as melancholy, floated invincibly. It would never betray the least concern at this transformation. And, indeed, I found plenty of charm in these bright projections, which seemed to emanate from a Merovingian past and shed around me the reflections of such ancient history. But I cannot express the discomfort I felt at this intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room which I had succeeded in filling with my own personality until I thought no more of it than of myself. That an aesthetic effect of habit being destroyed, I would begin to think on to feel of such melancholy things. The doorknob of my room, which was different to me from all the other doorknobs in the world, inasmuch as it seemed to move of its own accord and without my having to turn it, so unconscious had its manipulation become low and bold. It was now an astral body for Golo, and as soon as the dinner bell rang, I would hurry down to the dining room, where the big hanging lamp, ignorant of Golo and Bluebeard, but well acquainted with my family and the dish of stewed beef, shed the same light as on every other evening, and I would fall into the arms of my mother, whom the misfortunes of Genevieve de Brabant had made all the dearer to me, just as the crimes of Golo had driven me to a more than ordinarily scrupulous examination of my own conscience. But after dinner, alas, I was soon obliged to leave Mamma stayed talking with the others in the garden if it was fine, or in the little parlor where everyone took shelter when it was wet, everyone except my grandmother, who held that it's a pity to shut oneself indoors in the country, and used to have endless arguments with my father on the very wettest days, because he would send me up to my room with a book instead of letting me stay out of doors. That is not the way to make him strong and active, she would say sadly, especially this little man, who needs all the strength and willpower that he can get. My father would shrug his shoulders and study the barometer, for he took an interest in meteorology, while my mother, keeping very quiet so as not to disturb him, looked at him with tender respect, but not too hard, not wishing to penetrate the mysteries of his superior mind. But my grandmother, in all weathers, even when the rain was coming down in torrents and Françoise had rushed the precious wicker armchairs indoors, so that they should not get soaked, was to be seen pacing the deserted, rain-lashed garden, pushing back her disordered gray locks so that her forehead might be freer to absorb the health-giving draughts of wind and rain. She would say, "At last one can breathe," and would trot up and down the sodden paths of the straight and symmetrical for her liking, owing to the want of any feeling for nature in the new gardener, whom my father had been asking all morning if the weather were going to improve. Her keen, jerky little step, regulated by the various effects wrought upon her soul by the intoxication of the storm, the power of hygiene, the stupidity of my upbringing, and the symmetry of gardens, rather than by any anxiety of her that was quite known to her to save her plum-colored skirt from the mud-stains beneath which it would gradually disappear to a height that was the constant bane and despair of her maid. When these walks of my grandmother's took place after dinner, there was one thing which never failed to bring her back to the house. Of this was if at one of those points when her circular itinerary brought her back, moth-like, in sight of the lamp in the little parlor where the liquors were set out on the card table, and my great-aunt called out to her, baffled, "Come in and stop your husband drinking brandy," for simply to tease her, as she had brought so different a type of mind into my father's family that everyone made fun of her. And my great-aunt used to make my grandfather, who was forbidden liquors, take just a few drops. My poor grandmother would come in and beg and implore her husband not to taste the brandy, and he would get angry and gulp it down all the same. And she would go out again sad and discouraged, but still smiling, for she was so humble of heart and so gentle that her tenderness for others and her disregard for herself and her own troubles blended in a smile which, unlike those seen on the majority of human faces, bore no trace of irony save for herself, while for all of us kisses seemed to spring from her eyes, which could not look upon those she loved without seeming to bestow upon them passionate caresses. This torture inflicted on her by my great-aunt, the sight of my grandmother's vain entreaties, of her feeble attempts doomed in advance to remove the liqueur glass from my grandfather's hands, all these were things of the sort to which, in later years, one can grow so accustomed as to smile at them and to take the persecutor's side resolutely and cheerfully enough to persuade oneself that it is not really persecution. But in those days they filled me with such horror that I longed to strike my great-aunt. And yet, as soon as I heard her baffled, "Come in and stop your husband drinking brandy," and my cowardice, I became at once a man, and did what all we grown men do when face to face with suffering and injustice. I preferred not to see them. I ran up to the top of the house to cry by myself in a little room beside the schoolroom and beneath the roof, which smelt of orris root and was scented also by a wild currant bush which had climbed up between the stones of the outer wall and thrust a flowering branch in through the half-open window, intended for a more special and a baser use. This room, from which, in the daytime, I could see as far as the keep of Roussenville-Alpin, was for a long time my place of refuge, doubtless because it was the only room whose door I was allowed to lock whenever my occupation was such as required an inviolable solitude, or reading or daydreaming, tears or sensual pleasure. Alas, I did not realize that my own lack of willpower, my delicate health, and the consequent uncertainty as to my future weighed far more heavily on my grandmother's mind than any little dietary indiscretion by her husband in the course of those endless perambulations, afternoon and evening, during which we used to see her handsome face passing to and fro, half raised towards the sky, its brown and wrinkled cheeks, which with age had acquired almost the purple hue of tilled fields in autumn, covered, if she were going out, by a half-lifted veil, while upon them either the cold or some sad reflection invariably left the drying traces of an involuntary tear. My sole consolation when I went upstairs for the night was that Mamma would come in and kiss me after I was in bed. But this good night lasted for so short a time, she went down again so soon, that the moment in which I heard her climb the stairs, and then caught the sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, from which hung little tassels of plaited straw rustling along the double-ordered corridor, was for me a moment of the utmost pain, for it heralded the moment which was to follow it, when she would have left me and gone downstairs again, much so that I reached the point of hoping that this good night which I loved so much would come as late as possible, so as to prolong the time of respite during which Mamma would not yet have appeared. Sometimes when, after kissing me, she opened the door to go, I longed to call her back, to say to her, "Kiss me just once more," but I knew that then she would at once look displeased for the concession which she made to my wretchedness and agitation in coming up to give me this kiss of peace. Always annoyed my father, who thought such rituals absurd, and she would have liked to try to induce me to outgrow the habit of having her there at all, let alone get into the habit of asking her for an additional kiss when she was already crossing the threshold. And to see her look displeased destroyed all the calm and serenity she had brought me a moment before, when she had bent her loving face down over my bed, and held it up to me like a host for an act of peace-giving communion, in which my lips might imbibe her real presence, and with it the power to sleep. But those evenings on which Mamma stayed so short time in my room were sweet indeed compared to those on which we had people to dinner, and therefore she did not come at all. Our people were usually limited to Swan, apart from a few passing strangers, was almost the only person who ever came to the house at Cambrai, sometimes to a neighborly dinner, but less frequently since his unfortunate marriage, as my family did not care to receive his wife, and sometimes after dinner, uninvited, on those evenings when, as we sat in front of the house round the iron table, beneath the big chestnut tree, we heard, from the far end of the garden, not the shrill and assertive alarm bell which assailed and deafened with its frigidness, interminable, frozen sound any member of the household who set it off on entering without ringing, but the double tinkle, timid, oval, golden, of the visitor's bell. Everyone would at once exclaim, "A visitor! Who in the world can it be?" But they knew quite well that it could only be M. Swan, my great-aunt, speaking in a loud voice to set an example, in a tone which she endeavored to make sound natural, would tell the others not to whisper so that nothing could be more offensive to a stranger coming in, who would be led to think that people were saying things about him which he was not meant to hear. And then my grandmother, always happy to find an excuse for an additional turn in the garden, would be sent out to reconnoiter, and would take the opportunity to remove surreptitiously, as she passed, the stakes of a rose tree or two, so as to make the roses look a little more natural, as a mother might run her hand through her boy's hair after the barber has smoothed it down to make it look naturally wavy. We would all wait there in suspense for the report which my grandmother would bring back from the enemy lines, as though there might be a choice between a large number of possible assailants. And then, soon after, my grandfather would say, "I recognize Swan's voice." And indeed one could tell him only by his voice, for it was difficult to make out his face with its arched nose and green eyes, and her high forehead fringed with fair, almost red hair, done in the Bresson style one, because in the garden we used as little light as possible, so as not to attract mosquitoes, and I would slip away unobtrusively to order the liqueurs to be brought out, for my grandmother made a great point, thinking it nicer, of their not being allowed to seem anything out of the ordinary, which we kept for visitors only. Although a far younger man, M. Swan was very attached to my grandfather, who had been an intimate friend of Swan's father, an excellent but eccentric man, the ardor of whose feelings and the current of whose thoughts would often be checked or diverted by the most trifling thing. Several times in the course of a year I would hear my grandfather tell at table the story, which never varied, of the behavior of M. Swan the elder upon the death of his wife, by whose bedside he had watched day and night. Grandfather, who had not seen him for a long time, hastened to join him at the Swans, a family property on the outskirts of Cambrai, and managed to entice him for a moment, weeping profusely, out of the death chamber, so that he should not be present when the body was laid in its coffin. They took a turn or two in the park, where there was a little sunshine. Suddenly M. Swan seized my grandfather by the arm and cried, "Ah, my dear old friend, how fortunate we are to be walking here together on such a charming day. Don't you see how pretty they are, all these trees, my hawthorns, and my new pond, on which you have never congratulated me? You look as solemn as the grave. Don't you feel this little breeze? Or whatever you may say, it's good to be alive all the same, my dear Amelia." And then, abruptly, the memory of his dead wife returned to him, and probably thinking it too complicated to inquire into how, at such a time, he could have allowed himself to be carried away by an impulse of happiness, he confined himself to a gesture which he habitually employed whenever any perplexing question came into his mind, that is, he passed his hand across his forehead, rubbed his eyes, and wiped his glasses. And yet he never got over the loss of his wife, but used to say to my grandfather, during the 2 years by which he survived her, "It's a funny thing, now I very often think of my poor wife, but I cannot think of her for long at a time, often, but a little at a time, like poor old Swan," became one of my grandfather's favorite sayings, which he would apply to all manner of things. Have assumed that this father of Swan's had been a monster. If my grandfather, whom I regarded as a better judge than myself, and whose word was my law and often led me in the long run to pardon offenses which I should have been inclined to condemn, had not gone on to exclaim, "But after all, he had a heart of gold." For many years, during the course of which, especially before his marriage, Mme. Swan the younger came often to see them at Cambrai, my great-aunt and my grandparents never suspected that he had entirely ceased to live in the society which his family had frequented, and that, under the sort of incognito which the name of Swan gave him among us, they were harboring with the complete innocence of a family of respectable innkeepers who have in their midst some celebrated mine, without knowing it, one of the most distinguished members of the Jockey Club, a particular friend of the Comte de Paris and of the Prince of Wales, and one of the men most sought after in the aristocratic world of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Our utter ignorance of the brilliant social life which Swann led was, of course, due in part to his own reserve and discretion, but also to the fact that middle-class people in those days took what was almost a Hindu view of society, which they held to consist of sharply defined castes, so that everyone at his birth found himself called to that station in life which his parents already occupied, and from which nothing, save the accident of an exceptional career or of a good marriage, could extract you and translate you to a superior caste. Swann the elder had been a stockbroker, and so young Swann found himself immured for life in a caste whose members of fortunes, as in a category of taxpayers, varied between such and such limits of income. One knew the people with whom his father had associated, and so one knew his own associates, people with whom he was in a position to mix. If he knew other people besides, those were youthful acquaintances on whom the old friends of his family, like my relatives, shut their eyes all the more good-naturedly because Swann himself, after he was left an orphan, still came most faithfully to see us, but we would have been ready to wager that the people outside our acquaintance whom Swann knew were of the sort to whom he would not have dared to raise his hat if he had met them while he was walking with us, had it been absolutely essential to apply to Swann a social coefficient peculiar to himself, as distinct from all the other sons of other stockbrokers in his father's position. His coefficient would have been rather lower than theirs, because, being very simple in his habits, and having always had a craze for antiques and pictures, he now lived and amassed his collections in an old house which my grandmother longed to visit, but which was situated on the Quai d'Orleans, a neighborhood in which my great-aunt thought it most degrading to be quartered. Are you really a connoisseur, at least as she would say to him? I ask for your own sake, as you are likely to have fakes spammed off on you by the dealers, for she did not, in fact, endow him with any critical faculty, and had no great opinion of the intelligence of a man who, in conversation, would avoid serious topics, and showed a very dull prescience, not only when he gave us kitchen recipes, going into the most minute details, but even when my grandmother's sisters were talking to him about art. When challenged by them to give an opinion, or to express his admiration for some picture, he would remain almost disobligingly silent, and would then make amends by furnishing, if he could, some fact or other about the gallery in which the picture was hung, or the date at which it had been painted. But as a rule he would content himself with trying to amuse us by telling us about his latest adventure with someone whom we ourselves knew, such as the comrade chemist, or our cook, or our coachman. Stories certainly used to make my great-aunt laugh, but she could never decide whether this was on account of the absurd role which Swann invariably gave himself therein, or of the wit that he showed in telling them. I must say you really are a regular character, As she was the only member of our family who could be described as a trifle common, she would always take care to remark to strangers, when Swann was mentioned, that he could easily, had he so wished, have lived in the Boulevard Haussmann or the Avenue de l'Opéra, and that he was the son of old Swann, who must have left for 5,000,000 francs, but that it was a fad of his, a fad which, moreover, she thought was bound to amuse her people so much that in Paris, when Swann called on New Year's Day bringing her a little packet of Marin's glaces, she never failed, if there were strangers in the room, to say to him, "Oh well, Swann, and do you still live next door to the bonded warehouse, so as to be sure of not missing your train when you go to Lyons?" And she would peep out of the corner of her eye, over her glasses, at the other visitors. But if anyone had suggested to my great-aunt that this Swann, and his capacity as the son of Oldham, Swann, was fully qualified to be received by any of the best people, by the most respected barristers and solicitors of Paris, though he was perhaps a trifle inclined to let this hereditary privilege go by default, had another almost secret existence of a wholly different kind, that when he left our house in Paris, saying that he must go home to bed, he would no sooner have turned the corner than he would stop, retrace his steps, and be off to some salon on whose like no stockbroker or associate of stockbrokers had ever set eyes. But that would have seemed to my aunt as extraordinary as, to a woman of wider reading, the thought of being herself on terms of intimacy with Aristides, and of learning that after having a chat with her he would plunge deep into the realms of Thetis, into an emperor veiled from mortal eyes, in which Virgil depicts him as being received with open arms, or to be content with an image more likely to have occurred to her, for she had seen it painted on the plates we used for biscuits at Cambrai. As the thought of having had to dinner Ali Babu, as soon as he finds himself alone and undisturbed, will make his way into the cave, resplendent with its unsuspected treasures. One day when he had come to see us after dinner in Paris, apologizing for being in evening clothes, Françoise told us after he had left that she had got it from his coachman that he had been dining with a princess. "A nice sort of princess," retorted my aunt, shrugging her shoulders, without raising her eyes from her knitting, serenely sarcastic. Altogether, my great-aunt treated him with scant ceremony, since she was of the opinion that he ought to feel flattered by our invitations. She thought it only right and proper that he should never come to see us in summer without a basket of peaches or raspberries from his garden, and that from each of his visits to Italy he should bring back some photographs of old masters for me. It seemed quite natural, therefore, to send for him whenever a recipe for some special sauce or for a pineapple salad was needed for one of our big dinner parties, to which he himself would not be invited, being regarded as insufficiently important to be served up to new friends who might be in our house for the first time. If the conversation turned upon the princes of the house of France, "Gentlemen, you and I will never know, will we, and don't want to, do we?" my great-aunt would say tartly to Swann, had, perhaps, a letter from Twickenham in his pocket as she would make him push the piano into place and turn over the music on evenings when my grandmother's sister sang, manipulating this person who was elsewhere so sought after with the rough simplicity of a child who will play with the collector's apiece with no more circumspection than if it were a cheap gewgaw. Doubtless the Swan, who was a familiar figure in all the clubs of those days, differed hugely from the Swan created by my great-aunt when, of an evening, in our little garden at Combray, after the Touchy peals had sounded from the gate, she would inject and vitalize with everything she knew about the Swan family the obscure and shadowy figure who emerged, with my grandmother in his wake, from the dark background and who was identified by his voice. But then, even in the most insignificant details of our daily life, none of us can be said to constitute a material whole, which is identical for everyone, and need only be turned up like a page in an account book or the record of a will. Our social personality is a creation of the thoughts of other people. Even the simple act which we describe as seeing someone we know is to some extent an intellectual process. We pack the physical outline of the person we see with all the notions we have already formed about him, and in the total picture of him which we compose in our minds, those notions have certainly the principal place. In the end they come to fill out so completely the curve of his cheeks, to follow so exactly the line of his nose, that blend so harmoniously in the sound of his voice as if it were no more than a transparent envelope, that each time we see the face or hear the voice it is these notions which we recognize and to which we listen. And so, no doubt, from the Swan they had constructed for themselves, my family had left out in their ignorance a whole host of details of his life in the world of fashion, details which caused our people, when they met him, to see all the graces enthroned in his face and stopping at the line of his aquiline nose, as it a natural frontier. But they had contrived also to put into this face, divested of all glamour, vacant and roomy as in a demented house, to plant in the depths of these undervalued eyes a lingering residuum, vague but not unpleasing, a half memory and half oblivion of idle hours spent together after our weekly dinners, round the card table or in the garden during our companionable country life. Our friend's corporeal envelope had been so well lined with this residuum, as well as various earlier memories of his parents, that their own special Swan had become to my family a complete and living creature, so that even now I have the feeling of leaving someone I know for another quite different person when, going back in memory, I pass from the Swan whom I knew later and more intimately to this early Swan in whom I can distinguish the charming mistakes of my youth, and who in fact is less like his successor than he is like the other people I knew at that time, as though one's life were a picture gallery in which all the portraits of any one period had a marked family likeness. A similar tonality of this early Swan, abounding in leisure, fragrant with the scent of the great chestnut tree, of baskets of raspberries and of a sprig of tarragon. And yet one day, when my grandmother had gone to ask some favor of a lady whom she had known at the Sacré-Cœur and with whom, because of our notions of caste, she had not cared to keep up any degree of intimacy in spite of several common interests, the Marquise de Villepreux of the famous house of Boylan, this lady had said to her, "I believe you know M. Swan very well. He's a great friend of my nephew and niece, the Deslamies." My grandmother had returned from the call full of praise for the house, which overlooked some gardens, and in which Mme Philippers had advised her to rent a flat, and also for a repairing tailor and his daughter who kept a little shop in the courtyard, into which she had gone to ask them to put a stitch in her skirt, which she had torn on the staircase. My grandmother had found these people perfectly charming, and the girl, she said, was a jewel, and the tailor the best and most distinguished man she had ever seen. For in her eyes distinction was a thing wholly independent of social position. She was in ecstasies over some answer the tailor had made to her, saying to Mama Savine would not have put it better, and by way of contrast, of a nephew of Mme Villapers of whom she had met at the house of my dear, he is so common. Now, the effect of the remark about Swann had been, not to raise him, in my great-aunt's estimation, but to lower Mme Villepers's. Appeared that the deference which, on my grandmother's authority, owed to Mme Villepers's imposed on her the reciprocal obligation to do nothing that would render her less worthy of our regard, and that she had failed in this duty by becoming aware of Swann's existence and allowing members of her family to associate with him. Knows Swann, a person who, you always made out, was related to Marshal McMahon. This view of Swann's social position which prevailed in my family seemed to be confirmed later on by his marriage with a woman of the worst type, almost a prostitute, whom, to do him justice, he never attempted to introduce to us, for he continued to come to our house alone, the more and more seldom, but from whom they felt they could establish, on the assumption that he had found her there, the circle, unknown to them, in which he ordinarily moved. But on one occasion my grandfather read in a newspaper that Swann was one of the most regular attendants at the Sunday luncheons given by the Duc d'Aix, whose father and uncle had been among our most prominent statesmen in the reign of Louis Philippe. Now my grandfather was curious to learn all the smallest details which might help him to take a mental share in the private lives of men like Mole, Duc Pasquier, or the Duc de Broglie. He was delighted to find that Swann associated with people who had known them. My great-aunt, on the other hand, interpreted this piece of news in a sense discreditable to Swann for anyone who chose his associates outside the caste in which he had been born and bred, outside his proper station, automatically lowered himself in her eyes. It seemed to her that such a one abdicated all claim to enjoy the fruits of the splendid connections with people of good position which prudent parents cultivate and store up for their children's benefit, and she had actually ceased to see the son of a lawyer of our acquaintance because he had married a highness, and had thereby stepped down in her eyes from the respectable position of a lawyer's son to that of those adventurers, upstart footmen or stable boys mostly, to whom, we are told, queens have sometimes shown their favors. She objected, therefore, to my grandfather's plan of questioning Swann when next he came to dine with us about these people whose friendship with him we had discovered. At the same time my grandmother's two sisters, elderly spinsters who shared her nobility of character but lacked her intelligence, declared that they could not conceive what pleasure their brother-in-law could find in talking about such trifles. They were ladies of lofty aspirations, who for that reason were incapable of taking the least interest in what might be termed gossip, even if it had some historical import, or, generally speaking, in anything that was not directly associated with some aesthetic or virtuous object. So complete was their negation of interest in anything which seemed directly or indirectly connected with worldly matters that their sense of hearing, having finally come to realize its temporary futility, when the tone of the conversation at the dinner table became frivolous or merely mundane without the two old ladies of being able to guide it back to topics dear to themselves, would put its receptive organs into abeyance to the point of actually becoming atrophied. So that if my grandfather wished to attract the attention of the two sisters, he had to resort to some such physical stimuli as alienists adopt in dealing with their distracted patients, so to wit, repeated taps on a glass with the blade of a knife, accompanied by a sharp word and a compelling glance. Violent methods which these psychiatrists are apt to bring with them into their everyday life among the sane, either from force of professional habit or because they think the whole world a trifle mad. Their interest grew, however, when, the day before Swann was to dine with us, and when he had made them a special present of a case of Asti, my great-aunt, who had in her hand a copy of the Figaro in which to the name of a picture then on view in a court exhibition were added the words, from the collection of M. Charles Swann, asked, "Did you see that Swann is mentioned in the Figaro?" "But I've always told you," said my grandmother, "that he had a great deal of taste." "You would, of course," retorted my great-aunt, "say anything just to seem different from us. for knowing that my grandmother never agreed with her, and not being quite confident that it was her own opinion which the rest of us invariably endorsed, she wished to extort from us a wholesale condemnation of my grandmother's views, against which she hoped to force us into solidarity with her own. Silent, my grandmother's sisters having expressed a desire to mention to Swan this reference to him in the Figaro, my great-aunt dissuaded them whenever she saw in others an advantage, however trivial, which she herself lacked. She would persuade herself that it was no advantage at all but a drawback, and would pity so as not to have to envy them. I don't think that would please him at all. I know very well that I should hate to see my name printed like that, as large as life, in the paper, and I shouldn't feel at all flattered if anyone spoke to me about it. She did not, however, put any very great pressure upon my grandmother's sisters, for they, in their horror of vulgarity, had brought to such a fine art the concealment of a personal allusion in a wealth of ingenious circumlocution that it would often pass unnoticed even by the person to whom it was addressed. As for my mother, her only thought was of trying to induce my father to speak to Swan, not about his wife, but about his daughter, whom he worshipped, and for whose sake it was understood that he had ultimately made his unfortunate marriage. You need only say a word and just ask him how she is. It must be so very hard for him. My father, however, was annoyed. No, you have the most absurd ideas. It would be utterly ridiculous. But the only one of us in whom the prospect of Swan's arrival gave rise to an unhappy foreboding was myself. This was because on the evenings when there were visitors, or just Swan in the house, Mamma did not come up to my room. I dined before the others, and afterwards came and sat at a table until 8 o'clock, when it was understood that I must go upstairs to that frail and precious kiss which Mamma used normally to bestow on me when I was in bed, and just going to sleep had to be transported from the dining room to my bedroom, where I must keep it inviolate all the time that it took me to undress, without letting its sweet charm be broken, without letting its volatile essence diffuse itself and evaporate. And it was precisely on those very evenings when I needed to receive it with special care that I was obliged to take it, to snatch it brusquely and in public, without even having the time or the equanimity to bring to what I was doing the single-minded attention of lunatics who compel themselves to exclude all other thoughts from their minds while they are shutting a door, that when the sickness of uncertainty sweeps over them again they can triumphantly oppose it with the recollection of the precise moment when they shut the door. We were all in the garden when the double tinkle of the visitor's bell sounded shyly. Everyone knew that it must be Swan, and yet they looked at one another inquiringly and sent my grandmother to reconnoiter. See that you thank him intelligibly for the wine, my grandfather warned his two sisters-in-law. You know how good it is, and the case is huge. Now, don't start whispering, I said. My great-aunt, how would you like to come into a house and find everyone muttering to themselves, "Oh, there's Swan," cried my father. "Let's ask him if he thinks it will be fine tomorrow." My mother fancied that a word from her would wipe out all the distress which my family had contrived to cause Swan since his marriage. She found an opportunity to draw him aside for a moment, but I followed her. I could not bring myself to let her out of my sight, while I felt that in a few minutes I should have to leave her in the dining room and go up to my bed without the consoling thought, as on ordinary evenings, that she would come up later to kiss me. "Now, Swan," she said, "do tell me about your daughter. I'm sure she already has a taste for beautiful things, like her papa." "Come along and sit down here with us all on the veranda," said my grandfather, coming up to him. My mother had to abandon her quest, but managed to extract from the restriction itself a further delicate thought, like good poets whom the tyranny of rhyme forces into the discovery of their finest lines. "We can talk about her again when we are by ourselves," she said, or rather whispered to Swan. "Only a mother is capable of understanding these things. I'm sure that hers would agree with me." And so we all sat down round the iron table. I should have liked not to think of the hours of anguish which I should have to spend that evening, alone in my room, without being able to go to sleep. I tried to convince myself that they were of no importance, since I should have forgotten them next morning, and to fix my mind on thoughts of the future which would carry me, as on a bridge, across the terrifying abyss that yawned at my feet. But my mind, strained by this foreboding, distended like the look which I shot at my mother, would not allow any extraneous impression to enter. Thoughts did indeed enter it, but only on the condition that they left behind them every element of beauty, or even of humor, by which I might have been distracted or beguiled. As a surgical patient, thanks to a local anesthetic, can look on fully conscious while an operation is being performed upon him and yet feel nothing. I could repeat to myself some favorite lines, or watch my grandfather's efforts to talk to Swan about the duck data for Pasquare, without being able to kindle any emotion from the one or amusement from the other. Hardly had my grandfather begun to question Swan about that order when one of my grandmother's sisters, in whose ears the question echoed like a solemn but untimely silence which her natural politeness bade her interrupt, addressed the other with a "Just fancy, Flora. I met a young Swedish governess today who told me some most interesting things about the cooperative movement in Scandinavia. We really must have her to dine here one evening." "To be sure," said her sister Flora, "but I haven't wasted my time, either. I met such a clever old gentleman at him. Malbin quite well, and Malbin has told him every little thing about how he gets up his parts. It's the most interesting thing I ever heard. He's a neighbor of M. Ventiel's, and I never knew, and he's so nice. Besides, M. Ventiel is not the only one of his nice neighbors," cried my Aunt Celine in a voice that was loud because of shyness and forced because of premeditation, darting, as she spoke, what she called a significant glance at Swan and my Aunt Flora, who realized that this veiled utterance was Celine's way of thanking Swan for the asti, looked at him also with a blend of congratulation and irony, either because she simply wished to underline her sister's little witticism, or because she envied Swan as having inspired it, or because she imagined that he was embarrassed and could not help having a little fun at his expense. "I think it would be worthwhile," Flora went on, "to have this old gentleman to dinner. When you get him going on Malbant or Amemi Materna he will talk for hours on end." "That must be delightful," sighed my grandfather, in whose mind nature had unfortunately forgotten to include any capacity whatsoever for becoming passionately interested in the Swedish cooperative movement or in the methods employed by Malbant to get up his parts, just as it had forgotten to endow my grandmother's two sisters with a grain of that precious salt which one has oneself to add to taste in order to extract any savour from a narrative of the private life of Mole or of the Comte de Paris. "By the way," said Swan to my grandfather, "what I was going to tell you has more to do than you might think with what you were asking me just now, for in some respects there has been very little change. I came across a passage in St. Simon this morning which would have amused you. It's in the volume which covers his mission to Spain, and not one of the best, little more in fact than a journal, but at least a wonderfully well-written journal, which fairly distinguishes it from the tedious journals we feel bound to read morning and evening. I don't agree with you, there are some days when I find reading the papers very pleasant indeed." My Aunt Flora broke in to show Swan that she had read the note about his court in the Figaro. "Yes, and Celine went one better, when they write about things or people in whom we are interested." "I don't deny it," answered Swan in some bewilderment. "The fault I find with our journalism is that it forces us to take an interest in some fresh triviality or other every day, whereas only 3 or 4 books in a lifetime give us anything that is of real importance. Suppose that every morning, when we tore the wrapper off our paper with fevered hands, a transmutation were to take place, and we were to find inside it I don't know, or shall we say Pascal's pensies?" He articulated the title with an ironic emphasis so as not to appear pedantic. "And then, in the gilt, untooled volumes which we open once in 10 years, he went on, showing that contempt for worldly matters which some men of the world like to affect, we should read that the Queen of the Hellenes had arrived at Cannes, or that the Princess de Leon had given a fancy dress ball, and that way we should arrive at a happy medium, but at once regretting that he had allowed himself to speak of serious matters even in jest, he added ironically, "Oh, what a fine conversation we're having. I can't think why we climb to these lofty heights." And then, turning to my grandfather, "Well, St. Simon tells how Molevry had had the audacity to try to shake hands with his sons. You remember how he says of Molevry, 'And never did I find in that coarse bottle anything but ill humor, boorishness, and folly.'" Regretting that he had allowed himself to speak of serious matters even in jest, he added ironically, "Oh, what a fine conversation we're having. I can't think why we climb to these lofty heights." And then, turning to my grandfather, "Well, St. Simon tells how Molevry had had the audacity to try to shake hands with his sons. You remember how he says of Molevry, 'And never did I find in that coarse bottle anything but ill humor, boorishness, and folly.'" "Coarse or not, I know bottles in which there is something very different," said Flora briskly, feeling bound to thank Swan as well as her sister, since the present of Asti had been addressed to them both. Celine laughed. Swann was puzzled, but went on. Oh, I cannot say whether it was ignorance or cozenage, writes Saint Simon. He tried to give his hand to my children, and noticed it in time to prevent him. My grandfather was already in ecstasies over ignorance or cozenage. But Celine, the name of Saint Simon, a man of letters, having wrested the complete paralysis of her auditory faculties, I was indignant. What, you admire that? Oh well, it's a fine thing, I must say, but what's it supposed to mean? Isn't one man as good as the next? To what difference can it make whether he's a duke or a groom, so long as he's intelligent and kind? He had a fine way of bringing up his children, your Saint Simon, if he didn't teach them to shake hands with all decent folk. Really and truly, it's abominable, and you dare to quote it. And my grandfather, utterly depressed, realizing how futile it would be, against this opposition, to attempt to get Swann to tell him the stories which would have amused him, murmured to my mother, just tell me again that line of yours which always comforts me so much on these occasions. Oh, Isa, what virtues, Lord, thou makes it us abhor to. How good that is. I never took my eyes off my mother. I knew that when they were at table I should not be permitted to stay there for the whole of dinner time, and that mamma, for fear of annoying my father, would not allow me to kiss her several times in public, as I would have done in my room. And so I promised myself that in the dining room, as they began to eat and drink, and as I felt that our approach, I would put beforehand into this kiss, which was bound to be so brief and furtive, everything that my own efforts could muster, would carefully choose in advance the exact spot on her cheek where I would imprint it, and would so prepare my thoughts as to be able, thanks to these mental preliminaries, to consecrate the whole of the minute mamma would grant me to the sensation of her cheek against my lips, as a painter who can have his subject for short sittings only prepares his palette, and from what he remembers and from rough notes does in advance everything which he possibly can do in the sitter's absence. But tonight, before the dinner bell had sounded, my grandfather said with unconscious cruelty, "Oh, the little man looks tired, he'd better go up to bed. Besides, we're dining late tonight." And my father, who was less scrupulous than my grandmother or my mother in observing the letter of a treaty, went on, "Yes, run along off to bed." I would have kissed mamma then and there, but at that moment the dinner bell rang. "No, no, leave your mother alone. You said good night to one another. That's enough." And so I must set forth without Vaticanus. I must climb each step of the staircase against my heart, three, as the saying is, climbing in opposition to my heart's desire, which was to return to my mother, since she had not, by kissing me, given my heart leave to accompany me. That hateful staircase, up which I always went so sadly, gave out a smell of varnish, which had, as it were, absorbed and crystallized the special quality of sorrow that I felt each evening, and made it perhaps even crueler to my sensibility, because, when it assumed this olfactory guise, my intellect was powerless to resist it. When we have gone to sleep with a raging toothache and are conscious of it only as of a little girl whom we attempt, time after time, to pull out of the water, or line of Moliere, which we repeat incessantly to ourselves, it is a great relief to wake up, so that our intelligence can disentangle the idea of toothache from any artificial semblance of heroism or rhythmic cadence. It was the converse of this relief which I felt when my anguish at having to go up to my room invaded my consciousness in a manner infinitely more rapid, instantaneous, almost, a manner at once insidious and brutal, through the inhalation of far more poisonous than moral penetration of the smell of varnish peculiar to that staircase. Once in my room I had to stop at every loophole to close the shutters, to dig my own grave as I turned down the bedclothes, to wrap myself in the shroud of my nightshirt. But before burying myself in the iron bed, which had been placed there because on summer nights I was too hot, among the rep curtains of the four-poster, I was stirred to revolt, and attempted the desperate stratagem of a condemned prisoner. I wrote to my mother begging her to come upstairs for an important reason which I could not put in writing. My fear was that Françoise, my aunt's cook, who used to be put in charge of me when I was at Cambrai, might refuse to take my note. I had a suspicion that, in her eyes, to carry a message to my mother when there was a guest would appear as flatly inconceivable as for the doorkeeper of a theatre to hand a letter to an actor upon the stage, on the subject of things which might or might not be done. She possessed a code at once imperious, abundant, subtle, and uncompromising on points themselves imperceptible or irrelevant, which gave it a resemblance to those ancient laws which combat such cruel ordinances as the massacre of infants at the breast, with prohibitions of exaggerated refinement against seething the kid in his mother's milk, or eating of the sinew which is upon the hollow of the thigh. Code, judging by the sudden obstinacy which she would put into her refusal to carry out certain of our instructions, seemed to have provided for social complexities and refinements of it, which nothing in Branca's background or in her career as a servant in a village household could have put into her head. On we were obliged to assume that there was latent in her some past existence in the ancient history of France, noble and little understood as in those manufacturing towns, where old mansions still testify to their former courtly days, and chemical workers toil among delicately sculptured scenes from La Miracle de Théophile or Les Quarters fills Amen. In this particular instance, the article of her code which made it highly improbable that, barring an outbreak of fire, Françoise would go down and disturb Mamma in the presence of M. Swann for so unimportant a person as myself was one embodying the respect she showed not only for the family as for the dead, for the clergy, or for royalty, but also for the stranger within our gates, a respect which I should perhaps have found touching in a book, but which never failed to irritate me on her lips, because of the solemn and sentimental tones in which she would express it, and which irritated me more than usual this evening, when the sacred character with which she invested the dinner party might have the effect of making her decline to disturb its ceremonial. But to give myself a chance of success, I had no hesitation in lying, telling her that it was not in the least myself who had wanted to write to Mamma, but Mamma, who, on saying good night to me, had begged me not to forget to send her an answer about something she had asked me to look for, and that she would certainly be very angry if this note were not taken to her. Think that Françoise disbelieved me, for, like those primitive men whose senses were so much keener than our own, she could immediately detect, from signs imperceptible to the rest of us, the truth or falsehood of anything that we might wish to conceal from her. She studied the envelope for 5 minutes as though an examination of the paper itself and the look of my handwriting could enlighten her as to the nature of the contents, or tell her to which article of her code she ought to refer the matter. Then she went out with an air of resignation which seemed to imply its hard lines on parents having a child like that. A moment later she returned to say that they were still at the ice stage, and that it was impossible for the butler to deliver the note at once in front of everybody, but that when the finger bowls were put round he would find a way of slipping it into Mamma's hand. At once my anxiety subsided. It was now no longer as it had been a moment ago until tomorrow that I had lost my mother, since my little note, though it would know her, no doubt, and doubly so because this stratagem would make me ridiculous in Swann's eyes, it would at least admit me, invisible and enraptured, into the same room as herself, would whisper about me into her ear, since that forbidden and unfriendly dining room, where but a moment ago the ice itself with burned nuts in it and the finger bowls seemed to me to be concealing pleasures that were baleful and of a mortal sadness, because Mamma was tasting of them while I was far away, had opened its doors to me, and, like a ripe fruit which bursts through its skin, was going to pour out into my intoxicated heart the sweetness of Mamma's attention while she was reading what I had written. Now I was no longer separated from her. The barriers were down, an exquisite thread united us. Besides, that was not all, for surely Mamma would come. As for the agony through which I had just passed, I imagined that Swann would have laughed heartily at it if he had read my letter and had guessed its purpose, whereas, on the contrary, as I was to learn in due course, a similar anguish had been the bane of his life for many years, and no one perhaps could have understood my feelings at that moment so well as he. To him, anguish that comes from knowing that the creature one adores is in some place of enjoyment where oneself is not, and cannot follow to him that anguish came through love, to which it is in a sense predestined, by which it will be seized upon and exploited. But when, as had befallen me, it possesses one's soul before love has yet entered into one's life, then it must drift, awaiting love's coming, vague and free, without precise attachment, at the disposal of one sentiment today, of another tomorrow, of filial piety or affection for a friend, and the joy with which I first bound myself apprentice, when Prince was returned to tell me that my letter would be delivered. Swann, too, had known well that false joy which a friend or relative of the woman we love can give us, when, on his arrival at the house or theater where she is to be found, for some ball or party or first night at which he is to meet her, he sees us wandering outside, desperately awaiting some opportunity of communicating with her. He recognizes us, greets us familiarly, and asks what we are doing there. And when we invent a story of having some urgent message to give to his relative or friend, he assures us that nothing could be simpler, takes us in at the door, and promises to send her down to us in 5 minutes. How we love him, as. At that moment I loved Françoise, the good-natured intermediary who, by a single word, has made supportable, human, almost propitious, the inconceivable, infernal scene of gaiety in the thick of which we had been, imagining swarms of enemies, perverse and seductive, beguiling away from us, even making laugh at us, the woman we love, if we are to judge of them by him, of this relative who has accosted us and who is himself an initiate in those cruel mysteries that then the other guests cannot be so very demoniacal, those inaccessible and excruciating hours during which she was about to taste of unknown pleasures as suddenly, through an unexpected breach, we have broken into them, as suddenly we can picture to ourselves, we possess, we intervene upon, we have almost created one of the moments, the succession of which would have composed those hours, a moment as real as all the rest, if not actually more important to us, because our mistress is more intensely a part of it, namely, the moment in which he goes to tell her that we are waiting below. Doubtless the other moments of the party would not have been so very different from this one, would be no more exquisite, no more calculated to make us suffer, since this kind friend has assured us that of course she will be delighted to come down. It will be far more amusing for her to talk to you than to be bored up there. Alas, Swan had learned by experience that the good intentions of a third party are powerless to influence a woman who is annoyed to find herself pursued even into a ballroom by a man she does not love. Too often, the kind friend comes down again alone. My mother did not appear, but without the slightest consideration for my self-respect, which depended upon her keeping up the fiction that she had asked me to let her know the result of my search for something or other. Told Françoise to tell me, in so many words there is no answer, words I have so often since then heard the hall porters in grand hotels and the flunkies in gambling nooks and the like repeat to some poor girl who replies in bewilderment to what he said. Nothing. It's not possible. You did give him my letter, didn't you? Very well. I shall wait a little longer. And just as she invariably protests that she does not need the extra gas jet which the porter offers to light for her, and sits on there, hearing nothing further except an occasional remark on the weather which the porter exchanges with a bellhop whom he will send off suddenly when he notices the time to put some customer's wine on the ice. So, having declined Franca's offer to make me some tea or to stay beside me, I let her go off again to the pantry and lay down and shut my eyes, trying not to hear the voices of my family who were drinking their coffee in the garden. But after a few seconds I realized that, by writing that note to Mama, by approaching at the risk of making her angry so near to her that I felt I could reach out and grasp the moment in which I should see her again, I had cut myself off from the possibility of going to sleep until I actually had seen her, and my heart began to beat more and more painfully as I increased my agitation by ordering myself to keep calm and to acquiesce in my ill fortune. Then suddenly my anxiety subsided. A feeling of intense happiness coursed through me, as when a strong medicine begins to take effect and one's pain vanishes. I had formed a resolution to abandon all attempts to go to sleep without seeing Mama. Had made up my mind to kiss her at all costs, even though this meant the certainty of being in disgrace with her for long afterwards. When she herself came up to bed, the calm which succeeded my anguish filled me with extraordinary exhilaration, no less than my sense of expectation, my thirst for and my fear of danger. Noiselessly I opened the window and sat down on the foot of my bed. I hardly dared to move, in case they should hear me from below. Outside, things seemed frozen, wrapped in a mute intentness not to disturb the moonlight which, duplicating each of them and throwing it back by the extension in front of it of a shadow denser and more concrete than its substance, had made the whole landscape at once thinner and larger, like a map which, after being folded up, is spread out upon the ground. What had to move a leaf of the chestnut tree, for instance, unmoved, but its minute quivering, total, self-contained, finished down to its minutest gradation, and its last delicate tremor, did not impinge upon the rest of the scene, did not merge with it, remained circumscribed, exposed upon this surface of silence which absorbed nothing of them. The most distant sounds, which must have come from gardens at the far end of the town, could be distinguished with such exact finish that the impression they gave of coming from a distance seemed due only to their pianissima execution, like those movements on muted strings so well performed by the orchestra of the conservatory that, even though one does not miss a single note, one thinks nonetheless that they are being played somewhere outside, a long way from the concert hall, so that all the old subscribers, my grandmother's sisters too, when Swann had given them his seats, used to strain their ears as if they had caught the distant approach of an army on the march, which had not yet rounded the corner of the Rue de Treves. I was well aware that I had placed myself in a position in which none could be counted upon to involve me in graver consequences at my parents' hands, consequences far graver, indeed, than a stranger would have imagined, and such as he would have thought it could follow only some really shameful misdemeanor. But in the upbringing which they had given me, faults were not classified in the same order as in that of other children, and I had been taught to place at the head of the list, doubtless because there was no other class of faults from which I needed to be more carefully protected of those in which I can now distinguish the common feature that one succumbs to them by yielding to nervous impulse. But such a phrase had never been uttered in my hearing, and no one had yet accounted for my temptations in a way which might have led me to believe that there was some excuse for my giving in to them, or that I was actually incapable of holding out against them. Yet I could easily recognize this class of transgressions by the anguish of mind which preceded, as well as by the rigor of the punishment which followed them out, and I knew that what I had just done was in the same category as certain other sins for which I had been severely punished, though infinitely more serious than they. When I went up to meet my mother on her way up to bed, and when she saw that I had stayed up in order to say good night to her again in the passage, I should not be allowed to stay in the house a day longer. I should be packed off to school next morning, as so much was certain. Very well, had I been obliged, the next moment, to hurl myself out of the window, I should still have preferred such a fate, for what I wanted now was Mamma to say good night to her. I had gone too far along the road which led to the fulfillment of this desire to be able to retrace my steps. I could hear my parents' footsteps as they accompanied Swann to the gate, and when the clanging of the bell assured me that he had really gone, I crept to the window. Mamma was asking my father if he had thought the lobster good, and whether Swann had had a second helping of the coffee and pistachio ice. I thought it rather so, she was saying. Next time we shall have to try another flavor. I can't tell you, said my great-aunt, what a change I find in Swann. He's quite antiquated, as she had grown so accustomed to seeing Swann always in the same stage of adolescence that it was a shock to her to find him suddenly less young than the age she still attributed to him, and the others too were beginning to remark in Swann that abnormal, excessive, shameful, undeserved senescence of bachelors, of all those for whom it seems that the great day which knows no morrow must be longer than for other men, since for them it is void of promise, and from its dawn the moments steadily accumulated without any subsequent partition among offspring. I fancy he has a lot of trouble with that wretched wife of his, lives with a certain Monsieur de Charles, as all Combray knows. It's the talk of the town. My mother observed that, in spite of this, he had looked much less unhappy of late, and he doesn't nearly so often do that trick of his, so like his father, of wiping his eyes and drawing his hand across his forehead. I think myself that in his heart of hearts he no longer loves that woman. Why, of course he doesn't, answered my grandfather. He wrote me a letter about it ages ago, to which I took care to pay no attention, left no doubt as to his feelings, or at any rate his love, for his wife. Hullo, you two, you never thanked him for the Asti, he went on, turning to his sisters-in-law. What, we never thanked him, I think, between you and me, that I put it to him quite neatly, replied my Aunt Flora. Yes, you managed it very well, I admired you for it, said my Aunt Celine. But you did it very prettily too. Yes, I was rather proud of my remark about nice neighbors. What do you call that, thanking him? Shouted my grandfather. Heard that all right, but devil take me if I guessed it was meant for Swann. You may be quite sure he never noticed it. Come, a Swann isn't a fool. I'm sure he understood. You didn't expect me to tell him the number of bottles, or to guess what he paid for them? My father and mother were left alone and sat down for a moment. Then my father said, well, shall we go up to bed? As you wish, dear, though I don't feel at all sleepy. I don't know why. It can't be the coffee, so it wasn't strong enough to keep me awake like this. But I see a light in the servants' a hollow. Poor Françoise has been sitting up for me, so I'll get her to unhook me while you go in and dress. My mother opened the lattice door which led from the hall to the staircase. Presently I heard her coming upstairs to close her window. Went quietly into the passage, and my heart was beating so violently that I could hardly move, but at least it was throbbing no longer with anxiety, but with terror and joy. I saw in the well of the stair a light coming upwards from Mamma's candle. Then I saw Mamma herself, and I threw myself upon her. For an instant she looked at me in astonishment, not realizing what could have happened. Then her face assumed an expression of anger. She said not a single word to me, and indeed I used to go for days on end without being spoken to, for far more venial offenses than this. A single word from Mamma would have been an admission that further intercourse with me was within the bounds of possibility, and that might perhaps have appeared to me more terrible still, as indicating that, with such a punishment as was in store for me, mere silence and black looks would have been puerile. A word from her then would have implied the false calm with which one addresses a servant to whom one has just decided to give notice of the kiss one bestows on a son who is being packed off to enlist, which would have been denied him if it had merely been a matter of being angry with him for a few days. But she heard my father coming from the dressing room, where he had gone to take off his clothes, and to avoid the scene which he would make if he saw me, she said to me in a voice half stifled with anger, "Off you go at once. Do you want your father to see you waiting there like an idiot?" But I implored her again to come and say good night to me, terrified as I saw the light from my father's candle already creeping up the wall, but also making use of his approach as a means of blackmail, in the hope that my mother, not wishing him to find me there, as find me he must if she continued to refuse me, would give in and say, "Go back to your room." Too late my father was upon us. Instinctively I murmured, though no one heard me, "Am done for." I was not, however. My father used constantly to refuse to let me do things which were quite clearly allowed by the more liberal charters granted me by my mother and grandmother, because he paid no heed to principles, and because for him there was no such thing as the rule of law. For some quite irrelevant reason, or for no reason at all, he would at the last moment prevent me from taking some particular walk, one so regular, so hallowed, that to deprive me of it was a clear breach of faith. For again, as he had done this evening, long before the appointed hour, he would snap out a run along up to bed. Now no excuses, but at the same time, because he was devoid of principles in my grandmother's sense, he could not, strictly speaking, be called intransigent. He looked at me for a moment with an air of surprise and annoyance, and then when Mamma had told him, not without some embarrassment, what had happened, said to her, "Go along with him, then. You said just now that you didn't feel very sleepy, so stay in his room for a little. I don't need anything." "But, my dear," my mother answered timidly, "whether or not I feel sleepy is not the point, and we mustn't let the child get into the habit." "There's no question of getting into a habit," said my father, with a shrug of the shoulders. "You can see quite well that the child isn't happy. After all, we aren't gaolers. You will end by making him ill, and a lot of good that will do. There are 2 beds in his room. I'll tell Françoise to make up the big one for you, and stay with him for the rest of the night. Anyhow, I'm off to bed. I'm not so nervy as you. Good night." It was impossible for me to thank my father. He would have been exasperated by what he called mawkishness. I stood there, not daring to move. He was still in front of us, a tall figure in his white nightshirt, crowned with the pink and violet cashmere scarf which he used to wrap around his head since he had begun to suffer from neuralgia, standing like Abraham in the engraving after Benozzo Gottoli which had given me, telling Sarah that she must tear herself away from Isaac. Many years have passed since that night. The wall of the staircase up which I had watched the light of his candle gradually climb was long ago demolished, and in myself, too, many things have perished which I imagined would last forever, and new ones have risen, giving birth to new sorrows and new joys which in those days I could not have foreseen. Just as now the old are hard to understand, it is a long time, too, since my father has been able to say to Mamma, "Go along with the child." Never again will such moments be possible for me, but of late I have been increasingly able to catch, if I listen attentively, the sound of the sobs which I had the strength to control in my father's presence, and which broke out only when I found myself alone with Mamma. In reality, their echo has never ceased, and it is only because life is now grown more and more quite round about me that I hear them anew, like those convent bells which are so effectively drowned during the day by the noises of the street that one would suppose them to have stopped until they ring out again through the silent evening air. Mama spent the night in my room when I had just committed an offense for which I expected to be banished from the household. My parents gave me a far greater concession than I could ever have won as the reward of a good deed, even at the moment when it manifested itself in this crowning mercy. My father's behavior towards me still retained that arbitrary and unwarranted quality which was so characteristic of him, and which arose from the fact that his actions were generally dictated by chance, expeditious rather than based on any formal plan. And perhaps even what I called his severity when he sent me off to bed deserved that title less than my mother's or my grandmother's attitude. For his nature, which in some respects differed more than theirs from my own, had probably prevented him from realizing until then how wretched I was every evening, something which my mother and grandmother knew well, but they loved me enough to be unwilling to spare me that suffering which they hoped to teach me to overcome, so as to reduce my nervous sensibility and to strengthen my will, whereas my father, whose affection for me was of another kind, would not, I suspect, have had the same courage. For as soon as he had grasped the fact that I was unhappy, he had said to my mother, "Go and comfort him." Mamma stayed that night in my room, and it seemed that she did not wish to mar by recrimination those hours which were so different from anything that I had had a right to expect. For when Françoise, who guessed that something extraordinary must have happened when she saw Mamma sitting by my side, holding my hand, and letting me cry unchided, I said to her, "But, madam, what is young master crying for?" She replied, "Why, Françoise, he doesn't know himself as his nerves. Make up the big bed for me quickly and then go off to your own." Thus, for the first time, my unhappiness was regarded no longer as a punishable offense, but as an involuntary ailment which had been officially recognized, a nervous condition for which I was in no way responsible. I had the consolation of no longer having to mingle apprehensive scruples with the bitterness of my tears. I could weep henceforth without sin. I felt no small degree of pride either in Franca's presence at this return to humane conditions which, not an hour after Mamma had refused to come up to my room and had sent the snubbing message that I was to go to sleep, raised me to the dignity of a grown-up person, brought me of a sudden to a sort of puberty of sorrow, a monomission of tears. I ought to have been happy, I was not. It struck me that my mother had just made a first concession which must have been painful to her, that it was a first abdication on her part from the ideal she had formed for me, and that for the first time she was so brave had to confess herself beaten. It struck me that if I had just won a victory it was over her, that I had succeeded, as sickness or sorrow or age might have succeeded, in relaxing her will and undermining her judgment, and that this evening opened a new era, would remain a black date in the calendar. And if I had dared now, I should have said to Mamma, "No, I don't want you to, you mustn't sleep here." But I was conscious of the practical wisdom of what would nowadays be called the realism with which she tempered the ardent idealism of my grandmother's nature, and I knew that now the mischief was done she would prefer to let me enjoy the soothing pleasure of her company, and not to disturb my father again. Certainly my mother's beautiful face seemed to shine again with youth that evening, as she sat gently holding my hands and trying to check my tears, but this was just what I felt. Should not have been her anger would have saddened me less than this new gentleness, known to my childhood experience. I felt that I had, with an impious and secret finger, traced a first wrinkle upon her soul, and brought out a first white hair on her head. This thought redoubled my sobs, and then I saw that Mamma had never allowed herself to indulge in any new emotion with me, was suddenly overcome by my terrors, and had to struggle to keep back her own. When she realized that I had noticed this, she said to me with a smile, "Why, my little chick, my little canary, he's going to make Mamma as silly as himself if this goes on. Look, since you can't sleep, and Mamma can't either, we mustn't go on in this stupid way. We must do something. I'll get one of your books." But I had none there. "Would you like me to get out the books now that your grandmother is going to give you for your birthday? Just think it over first, and don't be disappointed if there's nothing new for you then." I was only too delighted, and Mamma went to fetch a parcel of books, of which I could not distinguish, through the paper in which they were wrapped, any more than their short, white format, but which, even at this first glimpse, brief and obscure as it was, bade fair to eclipse already the paintocks of New Year's Day and the silkworms of the year before. Books were La Mère Diable, François Champy, Le Petit Fidette, and Les Maîtres Summers. My grandmother, as I learned afterwards, had at first chosen Musset's poems, a volume of Rousseau, and an Indiano for, while she considered light reading as unwholesome as sweets and cakes. She did not reflect that the strong breath of genius might have upon the mind even of a child an influence at once more dangerous and less invigorating than that of fresh air and sea breezes upon his body. But when my father had almost called her an imbecile on learning the names of the books she proposed to give me, she had journeyed back by herself to Jugel of the Conti to the booksellers, so that there should be no danger of my not having my present in time. It was a boiling hot day, and she had come home so unwell that the doctor had warned my mother not to allow her to tire herself so, and had fallen back upon the four pastoral novels of George Sand. My dear, she had said to Mamma, I could not bring myself to give the child anything that was not well written. The truth was that she could never permit herself to buy anything from which no intellectual profit was to be derived, above all the profit which fine things afford us by teaching us to seek our pleasures elsewhere than in the barren satisfaction of worldly wealth. Even when she had to make someone a present of the kind called useful, when she had to give an armchair or some table a silver or walking a stick, she would choose antiques, as though their long descendant had effaced from them any semblance of utility and fitted them rather to instruct us in the lives of the men of other days than to serve the common requirements of our own. She would have liked me to have in my room photographs of ancient buildings or of beautiful places, but at the moment of buying them, and for all that the subject of the picture had an aesthetic value, she would find that vulgarity and utility had to prominent a part in them. Through the mechanical nature of their reproduction by photography, she attempted by a subterfuge, if not to eliminate altogether this commercial banality, at least to minimize it, to supplant it to a certain extent with what was art still, to introduce, as it were, several thicknesses of art instead of photographs of Chartres Cathedral, of the fountains of St. Cloud, or of Vesuvius. She would inquire of Swan whether some great painter had not depicted them, and preferred to give me photographs of Chartres Cathedral after Corot, of the fountains of St. Cloud after Hubert Robert, and of Vesuvius after Turner, which were a stage higher in the scale of art. But although the photographer had been prevented from reproducing directly these masterpieces or beauties of nature, and had there been replaced by a great artist, he resumed his odious position when it came to reproducing the artist's interpretation. Accordingly, having to reckon again with vulgarity, my grandmother would endeavor to postpone the moment of contact still further. She would ask Swan if the picture had not been engraved, preferring, when possible, old engravings with some interest of association apart from themselves, such, for example, as show us a masterpiece in a state in which we can no longer see it today, like Morgan's print of Leonardo's Last Supper before its defacement. It must be admitted that the results of this method of interpreting the art of making presents were not always happy. The idea which I formed of Venice, from a drawing by Titian which is supposed to have the lagoon in the background, was certainly far less accurate than what I should have derived from ordinary photographs. We could no longer keep count in the family when my great-aunt wanted to draw up an indictment of my grandmother of all the armchairs she had presented to married couples, young and old, which on a first attempt to sit down upon them had at once collapsed beneath the weight of their recipients. But my grandmother would have thought it sordid to concern herself too closely with the solidity of any piece of furniture in which could still be discerned a flourish, a smile, a brave conceit of the past, and even what in such pieces answered a material need, since it did so in a manner to which we are no longer accustomed, charmed her like those old forms of speech in which we can still see traces of a metaphor whose fine point has been worn away by the rough usage of our modern tongue. Happened, the pastoral novels of George Sand which she was giving me for my birthday were regular lumber rooms full of expressions that have fallen out of use and become quaint and picturesque, and are now only to be found in country dialects, and my grandmother had bought them in preference to other books, as she would more readily have taken a house with a Gothic Dovic or some other such piece of antiquity as will exert a benign influence on the mind by giving it a hankering for impossible journeys through the realms of time. Mamma sat down by my bed as she had chosen Françoise Champy, whose reddish cover and incomprehensible title gave it, for me, a distinct personality and a mysterious attraction. I had not then read any real novels. I had heard it said that George Sand was a typical novelist. This predisposed me to imagine that Françoise Champy contained something inexpressibly delicious. The narrative devices designed to arouse curiosity or melt to pity, certain modes of expression which disturb or sadden the reader, and which, with a little experience, he may recognize as common to a great many novels. seemed to me for whom a new book was not one of a number of similar objects, but, as it were, unique person, absolutely self-contained as simply an intoxicating distillation of the peculiar essence of François Champy. Everyday incidents, the ordinary objects in common words, I sensed a strange and individual tone of voice. The plot began to unfold to me. It seemed all the more obscure because in those days, when I read, I used often to daydream about something quite different for page after page, and the gaps which this habit left in my knowledge of the story were widened by the fact that when it was Mama who was reading to me aloud, she left all the love scenes out, and so all the odd changes which take place in the relations between the miller's wife and the boy, changes which only the gradual dawning of love can explain, seemed to me steeped in a mystery the key to which I readily believed lay in that strange and mellifluous name of Champy, which invested the boy who bore it. I had no idea why, with its own vivid, ruddy, charming color. My mother was not a faithful reader. She was none the less an admirable one when reading a work in which she found the note of true feeling, and the respectful simplicity of her interpretation, and the beauty and sweetness of her voice, even in ordinary life, when it was not works of art but men and women whom she was moved to pity or admire. It was touching to observe with what deference she would banish from her voice, her gestures, from her whole conversation, now the note of gaiety, which might have distressed some mother who had once lost a child, now the recollection of an event or anniversary which might have reminded some old gentleman of the burden of his years, now the household topic which might have bored some young man of letters. And so, when she read aloud the prose of George Sand, prose which is everywhere redolent of that generosity and moral distinction which Mamma had learned from my grandmother to place above all other qualities in life, and which I was not to teach her until much later, to refrain from placing above all other qualities in literature, to taking pains to banish from her voice any pettiness or affectation which might have choked that powerful stream of language. She supplied all the natural tenderness, all the lavish sweetness which they demanded to sentences which seemed to have been composed for her voice, and which were all, so to speak, within the compass of her sensibility. She found to tackle them in the required tone the warmth of feeling which pre-existed and dictated them, but which is not to be found in the words themselves, and by this means she smoothed away, as she read, any harshness or discordance in the tenses of verbs, endowing the imperfect and the preterite with all the sweetness to be found in generosity, all the melancholy to be found in love, guiding the sentence that was drawing too close towards the one that was about to begin, now hastening, now slackening the pace of the syllables so as to bring them, despite their differences of quantity, into uniform rhythm, and breathing into this quite ordinary prose a kind of emotional life and continuity. My aching heart was soothed. I let myself be borne upon the current of this gentle night on which I had my mother by my side. I knew that such a night could not be repeated, or that the strongest desire I had in the world, namely, to keep my mother in my room through the sad hours of darkness, ran too much counter to general requirements and to the wishes of others for such a concession as had been granted me this evening to be anything but a rare and artificial exception. Tomorrow night my anguish would return, and Mamma would not stay by my side. But when my anguish was assuaged, I could no longer understand it. Besides, tomorrow was still a long way off. I told myself that I should still have time to take preventive action, although that time could bring me no access of power, since these things were in no way dependent upon the exercise of my will, and seemed not quite inevitable only because they were still separated from me by this short interval. And so it was that, for a long time afterwards, when I lay awake at night and revived old memories of Cambrai, I saw no more of it than this sort of luminous panel, sharply defined against a vague and shadowy background, like the panels which the glow of a Bengal light or a searchlight beam will cut out and illuminate in a building, the other parts of which remain plunged in darkness broad enough at its base. Little parlor, the dining room, the opening of the dark path from which M. Swan, that witting author of my sufferings, would emerge, the hall through which I would journey to the first step of that staircase, so painful to climb, which constituted, all by itself, the slender cone of this irregular pyramid, and, at the summit, my bedroom, with the little passage through whose glazed door Mamma would enter in a word, seen always at the same evening hour, isolated from all its possible surroundings, detached and solitary against the dark background, the bare minimum of scenery necessary, like the decor one sees prescribed on the title page of an old play, for its performance in the provinces of two. The drama of mine resina as though all Cambrai had consisted of but two floors joined by a slender staircase, and as though there had been no time there but 7 o'clock at night. I must own that I could have assured any questioner that Cambrai did include other scenes and did exist at other hours than these. But since the facts which I should then have recalled would have been prompted only by voluntary memory, the memory of the intellect, and since the pictures which that kind of memory shows us preserve nothing of the past itself, I should never have had any wish to ponder over this residue of Cambrai. To me it was in reality all dead. Permanently dead, oh very possibly. There is a large element of chance in these matters, and a second chance occurrence, that of our own death, often prevents us from awaiting for any length of time the favors of the first. I feel that there is much to be said for the Celtic belief that the souls of those whom we have lost are held captive in some inferior being, an animal, in a plant, in some inanimate object, and thus effectively lost to us until the day of which to many never comes, or when we happen to pass by the tree or to obtain possession of the object which forms their prison, and they start and tremble. They call us by our name, and as soon as we have recognized them the spell is broken. Delivered by us, they have overcome death and returned to share our life. And so it is with our own past. It is a labor in vain to attempt to recapture it. All the efforts of our intellect must prove futile. The past is hidden somewhere outside the realm, beyond the reach of intellect, and some material object in the sensation which that material object will give us, of which we have no inkling, and it depends on chance whether or not we come upon this object before we ourselves must die. Many years had elapsed during which nothing of Cambrai, except what lay in the theater and the drama of my going to bed there, had any existence for me, when one day in winter, on my return home, my mother, seeing that I was cold, offered me some tea, a thing I did not ordinarily take. I declined at first, and then, for no particular reason, changed my mind. She sent for one of those squat, plump little cakes, called petites madeleines, which look as though they had been molded in the fluted valve of a scallop shell, and soon, mechanically, dispirited after a dreary day with the prospect of a depressing morrow, raised to my lips a spoonful of the tea in which I had soaked a morsel of the cake. No sooner had the warm liquid mixed with the crumbs touched my palate than a shiver ran through me, and I stopped, intent upon the extraordinary thing that was happening to me. An exquisite pleasure had invaded my senses, something isolated, detached, with no suggestion of its origin, and at once the vicissitudes of life had become indifferent to me, its disasters innocuous, its brevity illusory. Of this new sensation, having had the effect which love has, of filling me with a precious essence, or rather this essence was not in me, it was me. I had ceased now to feel mediocre, contingent, mortal. Whence could it have come to me? This all-powerful joy, I sensed that it was connected with the taste of the tea and the cake, but that it infinitely transcended those savours. Could not, indeed, be of the same nature. Where did it come from? What did it mean? How could I seize and apprehend it? I drink a second mouthful, in which I find nothing more than in the first, then a third, which gives me rather less than the second. It is time to stop. The potion is losing its virtue. It is plain that the truth I am seeking lies not in the cup but in myself. The drink has called it into being, but does not know it, and can only repeat indefinitely, with a progressive diminution of strength, the same message which I cannot interpret, though I hope at least to be able to call it forth again and to find it there presently, intact and at my disposal. For my final enlightenment, I put down the cup and examine my own mind. It alone can discover the truth. But how? What an abyss of uncertainty! Whenever the mind feels overtaken by itself, or when it, the seeker, is at the same time the dark region through which it must go seeking, and where all its equipment will avail it nothing. Seek a more than that to create. It is face to face with something which does not yet exist, which it alone can make actual, which it alone can bring into the light of day. And I begin again to ask myself what it could have been, this unremembered state which brought with it no logical proof, but the indisputable evidence of its felicity, its reality, and in whose presence other states of consciousness melted and vanished. I want to try to make it reappear. I retrace my thoughts to the moment at which I drank the first spoonful of tea. I rediscover the same state, illuminated by no fresh light. Ask my mind to make one further effort, to bring back once more the fleeting sensation, and so that nothing may interrupt it in its course. I shut out every obstacle, every extraneous idea. I stopped my ears and screened my attention from the sounds from the next room, and then, feeling that my mind is tiring itself without having any success to report, I compel it for a change to enjoy the distraction which I have just denied it, to think of other things, to rest and refresh itself before making a final effort, and then for the second time I clear an empty space in front of it. I place in position before my mind's eye the still recent taste of that first mouthful, and I feel something start within me, something that leaves its resting place and attempts to rise, something that has been anchored at a great depth. I do not know yet what it is, but I can feel it mounting slowly. I can measure the resistance. I can hear the echo of great spaces traversed. Undoubtedly, what is thus palpitating in the depths of my being must be the image, the visual memory which, being linked to that taste, is trying to follow it into my conscious mind. But its struggles are too far off. Confused and cloudicus, scarcely can I perceive the neutral glow into which the elusive whirling medley of stirred-up colors is fused, and I cannot distinguish its form, cannot invent it is the one possible interpreter to translate for me the evidence of its contemporary, its inseparable paramour. The taste cannot ask it to inform me what special circumstance is in question, from what period in my past life will it ultimately reach the clear surface of my consciousness? This memory, this old dead moment which the magnetism of an identical moment has traveled so far too important to disturb, to raise up out of the very depths of my being, I cannot tell. Now I feel nothing, and it has stopped, has perhaps sunk back into its darkness, from which who can say whether it will ever rise again? At 10 times over I must essay the task, must lean down over the abyss, and each time the cowardice that deters us from every difficult task, every important enterprise, has urged me to leave the thing alone, to drink my tea and to think merely of the worries of today and my hopes for tomorrow, which can be brooded over painlessly. And suddenly the memory revealed itself. The taste was that of the little piece of Madeleine which on Sunday mornings at Cambrai, because on those mornings I did not go out before Masso, when I went to say good morning to her in her bedroom, my Aunt Lenny used to give me, dipping it first in her own cup of tea or tisane. The sight of the little Madeleine had recalled nothing to my mind before I tasted it, perhaps because I had so often seen such things in the meantime, without tasting them, on the trays and pastry cooks' windows, that their image had dissociated itself from those Cambrai days to take its place among others more recent, or perhaps because of those memories so long abandoned and put out of mind. Nothing now survived. Everything was scattered of the shapes of things, including that of the little scalpel of pastry, so richly sensual under its severe religious folds, were either obliterated or had been so long dormant as to have lost the power of expansion which would have allowed them to resume their place in my consciousness. But when from a long distant past nothing subsists, after the people are dead, after the things are broken and scattered, taste and smell alone, more fragile but more enduring, more immaterial, more persistent, more faithful, remain poised a long time, like souls, remembering, waiting, hoping, amid the ruins of all the rest, and bare, unflickering, in the tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence, the vast structure of recollection. Cambrai, a distance, from a 20-mile radius, as we used to see it from the railway when we arrived there in the week before Easter, was no more than a church epitomizing the town, representing it, speaking of it in for it to the horizon, and as one drew near, gathering close about its long dark cloak, sheltering from the wind on the open plain, as a shepherdess gathers her sheep, the woolly gray backs of its huddled houses, which the remains of its medievally ramparts enclosed, here and there, in an outline as scrupulously circular as that of a little town in a primitive painting. To live in Cambrai was a trifle depressing, like its streets, built of the blackened stone of the country, fronted with outside steps, capped with gables which projected long shadows downwards, were so dark that as soon as the sun began to go down one had to draw back the curtains in the sitting-room windows. Streets with the solemn names of saints, not a few of whom figured in the history of the early lords of Cambrai, such as the Rue Saint-Hilaire, the Rue Saint-Jacques, in which my aunt's house stood, the Rue Saint-Hildegarde, which ran past her railings, and the Rue du Saint-Esprit, on to which the little garden gate opened out. These Cambrai streets exist in so remote a corner of my memory, painted in colors so different from those in which the world is decked for me today, that in fact one and all of them, and the church which towered above them in the square seemed to me now more unreal than the projections of my magic lantern now, and at times I feel that to be able to cross the Rue Saint-Hilaire again, to engage a room in the Rue de l'Oiseau, in the old hostelry of the Liso Flesh, from whose basement windows used to rise a smell of cooking which rises still in my mind now and then in the same warm and intermittent dust, would be to secure a contact with the beyond more marvellously supernatural than it would be to make Golo's acquaintance and to chat with Genevieve de Brabant, my grandfather's cousin. Out by courtesy, my great-aunt with whom we used to stay was the mother of that Aunt Lenny who, since her husband's and my Uncle Octave's death, had gradually declined to leave first Cambrai, then her house in Cambrai, then her bedroom, and finally her bed, and now never came down, but lay perpetually in a vague state of grief, physical debility, illness, obsession, and piety. Private apartment looked out over the Rue Saint-Jacques, which ran a long way further to end in the Grand Prix as distinct from the Petit Prix, a green space in the center of the town where three streets met and which, monotonous and gray, with the three high sandstone steps before almost every one of its doors, seemed like a deep furrow carved by some sculptor of Gothic images out of the block of stone from which he might have fashioned a Calvary or a crib. Nine's life was now practically confined to two adjoining rooms, in one of which she would spend the afternoon while the other was being aired. They were rooms of that country order which were just as in certain climes whole tracts of air or ocean are illuminated or scented by myriads of protozoa which we cannot see, or enchants us with the countless odors emanating from the virtues, wisdom, habits, a whole secret system of life, invisible, superabundant, and profoundly moral, which their atmosphere holds in solution as smells natural enough indeed, and weather-tinted like those of the neighboring countryside, but already humanized, domesticated, snug, and exquisite, limpid jelly skillfully blended from all the fruits of the year which have left the orchard for the storeroom, smells changing with the season, but plenishing and homely, offsetting the sharpness of orphrist with the sweetness of warm bread, smells lazy and punctualized, a village clock, roving and settled, heedless and provident, linen smells, morning smells, pie smells, rejoicing in a peace which brings only additional anxiety, and in a prosainess which serves as a deep reservoir of poetry to the stranger who passes through their midst without having lived among them. The air of those rooms was saturated with the fine bouquet of a silence so nourishing, so succulent, that I never went into them without a sort of greedy anticipation, particularly on those first mornings, chilly still, of the Easter holidays, when I could taste it more fully because I had only just arrived in Cambrai before I went in to say good morning to mine. I would be kept waiting a moment in the outer room where the sun, wintry still, had crept in to warm itself before the fire, which was already alight between its two bricks and plastering the whole room with a smell of soot, turning it into one of those great rustic open hearths, or one of those canopied mantelpieces in country houses, beneath which one sits hoping that in the world outside it is raining or snowing, hoping almost for a catastrophic deluge to add the romance of being in winter quarters to the comfort of a snug retreat. I would pace to and fro between the prie-dieu and the stamped velvet armchairs, each one always draped in its crocheted and time scarf, while the fire, baking like dough, the pepites and smells with which the air of the room was thickly clotted, in which the moist and sunny freshness of the morning had already raised and started to set, puffed them and glazed them, and fluted them and swelled them into an invisible though not impalpable country pie, an immense turnover to which, barely waiting to savour the crisper, more delicate, more reputable but also drier aromas of the cupboard, the chest of drawers, and the pattern wall paper, I always returned with an unconfessed gluttony to wallow in the central glutinous, insipid, indigestible, and fruity smell of the floured bedspread. In the next room I could hear my aunt talking quietly to herself, never spoke except in low tones, because she believed that there was something broken inside her head and floating loose there, which she might displace by talking too loud, but she never remained for long, even when alone, without saying something, because she believed that it was good for her throat, and that by keeping the blood there in circulation it would make less frequent the chokings and the pains from which she suffered. Besides, in the life of complete inertia which she led, she attached to the least of her sensations an extraordinary importance, endowed them with a protein ubiquity which made it difficult for her to keep them to herself, and, failing a confidant to whom she might communicate them, she used to promulgate them to herself in an unceasing monologue which was her sole form of activity. Unfortunately, having formed the habit of thinking aloud, she did not always take care to see that there was no one in the adjoining room, and I would often hear her saying to herself, I must not forget that I never slept a wink, for never sleeping a wink was her great claim to distinction, and one admitted and respected in our household vocabulary. And the morning Françoise would not wake her, but would simply go into her during the day. When Maya wished to take a nap, we used to say just that she wished to ponder or to rest, and when in conversation she so far forgot herself as to say what woke me up, or I dreamed that, she would blush and at once correct herself. After waiting a minute, I would go in and kiss her. Françoise would be making her tea, or, if Maya felt agitated, she would ask instead for her tisane, and it would be my duty to shake out of the chemist's little package onto a plate the amount of lima blossom required for infusion. In boiling water, the drying of the stems had twisted them into a fantastic trellis, in the interlaces of which the pale flowers opened, as though a painter had arranged them there, grouping them in the most decorative poses. The leaves, having lost or altered their original appearance, resembled the most disparate things: the transparent wing of a fly, the blank side of a label, the petal of a rose, which had all been piled together, pounded or interwoven like the materials for a nest. Thousand trifling little details, a charming prodigality on the part of the chemist, details which would have been eliminated from an artificial preparation, gave me, like a book in which one reads with astonished delight the name of a person one knows, the pleasure of finding that these were sprigs of real lime trees, like those I had seen when coming from the train in the Avenue de la Gare, altered indeed precisely because they were not imitations but themselves, and because they had aged, and as each new character is merely a metamorphosis from something earlier, and these little gray balls are recognized green buds, plucked before their time, but beyond all's the rosy, lunar, tender gleam that lit up the blossoms among the frail forest of stems from which they hung like little golden roses, a marking, as the glow upon an old wall still marks the place of a vanished fresco, the difference between those parts of the tree which had and those which had not been. In color, showed me that these were indeed petals which, before filling the chemist's bag with their spring fragrance, had perfumed the evening air. That rosy candle was still their color, but half extinguished and deadened in the diminished life which was now theirs, and which may be called the twilight of a flower. Presently mind would dip a little Madeleine in the boiling infusion, whose taste of dead leaves or faded blossoms she so relished, and hand me a piece when it was sufficiently soft. At one side of her bed stood a big yellow chest of drawers of lemon wood, and a table which served at once as dispensary and high altar, on which, beneath a statue of the Virgin and a bottle of Vichy Celestins, might be found her prayer books and her medical prescriptions, everything that she needed for the performance, in bed, of her duties to soul and body, to keep the proper times for pepsin and for vespers. The other side her bed was bounded by the window, as she had the street in full view, and would while away the time by reading in it from morning to night, like the Persian princes of old, the daily but immemorial chronicles of Cambrai, which she would discuss in detail later with Françoise. Scarcely had I been 5 minutes with mine before she would send me away for fear that I might tire her. She would hold out for me to kiss her sad, pale, lackluster forehead, on which at this early hour she would not yet have ranged the false hair, and through which the bones shone like the points of a crown of thorns or the beads of a rosary, and she would say to me, now, my poor child, off you go and get ready for Masso, and if you see Françoise downstairs, tell her not to stay too long, amusing herself with you, as she must come up soon to see if I need anything. Françoise had been for many years in my aunt's service, and did not at that time suspect that she would one day be transferred entirely to ours, was a little inclined to neglect mine during the months which we spent there. There had been in my early childhood, before we first went to Cambrai, and when my Aunt Lenny used still to spend the winter in Paris with her mother, a time when I knew Françoise so little that on New Year's Day, before going into my great-aunt's house, my mother would put a 5-franc piece into my hand and say, now be careful, don't make any mistake. Wait until you hear me say good morning, Françoise, and tap you on the arm before you give it to her. No sooner had we arrived in my aunt's dark hall than we saw in the gloom, beneath the frills of a snowy bonnet as stiff and fragile as if it had been made of spun sugar, the concentric ripples of a smile of anticipatory gratitude. It was Françoise, motionless and erect, framed in the small doorway of the corridor like the statue of a saint in its niche. When we had grown more accustomed to this religious darkness, we could discern in her features the disinterested love of humanity, the tender respect for the gentry, which the hope of receiving the year bounty intensified in the nobler regions of her heart. Mamma pinched my arm sharply and said in a loud voice, "Good morning, Françoise." This signal my fingers parted and I let fall the coin, which found a receptacle in a shy but outstretched hand. But since we had begun to go to Cambrai, there was no one I knew better than Françoise. We were her favorites, and in the first years at least she showed for us not only the same consideration as for mine, but a keener relish, because we had, in addition to the prestige of belonging to the family of her, she had for those invisible bonds which the community of blood creates between the members of a family as much respect as any Greek tragedian, and the charm of not being her customary employers. And so with what joy would she welcome us, with what sorrow complain that the weather was still so bad for us on the day of our arrival, just before Easter, when there was often an icy wind, while Mamma inquired after her daughter and her nephews, and if her grandson was a nice boy, and what they were going to do with him, and whether he took after his granny. And later, when no one else was in the room, Mamma, who knew that Françoise was still mourning for her parents, who had been dead for years, would speak to her kindly about them, asking her endless little questions concerning their lives. She had guessed that Françoise was not over fond of her son-in-law, and that he spoiled the pleasure she found in visiting her daughter, with whom she could not talk so freely when he was there. And so when Françoise was going to their house, some miles from Cambrai, Mamma would say to her with a smile, "Tell me, Françoise, if Julien has had to go away, and you have Marguerite to yourself all day, you'll be very sorry, but you will make the best of it, won't you?" And Françoise answered, laughing, "Madame knows everything. Madame is worse than the X-rays," as she pronounced the X with an affectation of difficulty and a self-mocking smile that someone so ignorant should employ this learned term that they brought here for Mme octave, and which can see what's in your heart. And she went off, overwhelmed that anyone should be caring about her, perhaps anxious that we should not see her in tears. Mamma was the first person who had given her the heartwarming feeling that her peasant existence, with its simple joys and sorrows, might be an object of interest, might be a source of grief or pleasure to someone other than herself. Mai resigned herself to doing without Françoise to some extent during our visits, knowing how much my mother appreciated the services of so active and intelligent a maid, one who looked as smart at 5 o'clock in the morning in her kitchen, and her bonnet whose stiff and dazzling frills seemed to be made of porcelain, as when dressed for our Maso, who did everything in the right way, toiling like a horse, whether she was well or ill, but without fuss, without the appearance of doing anything. And the only one of my aunt's maids who, when Mamma asked for hot water or black coffee, would bring them actually boiling. She was one of those servants who, in a household, seem least satisfactory at first to a stranger, doubtless because they take no pains to make a conquest of him and show him no special attention, knowing very well that they have no real need of him, that he will cease to be invited to the house sooner than they will be dismissed from it, but who, on the other hand, are most prized by masters and mistresses who have tested and proved their real capacity, and care nothing for that superficial affability, that servile chit-chat which may impress a stranger favorably, but often conceals an incurable incompetence. When Françoise, having seen that my parents had everything they required, first went upstairs again to give my aunt her pepsin, and to find out from her what she would take for lunch, it was rare indeed for her not to be called upon to give an opinion, or to furnish an explanation, in regard to some important event. Just fancy, Françoise and Mme Goupil went by more than a quarter of an hour late to fetch her sister. If she loses any more time on the way, I shouldn't be at all surprised if she arrived after the elevation. Well, there'd be nothing wonderful in that, would be the answer. Françoise, if you had come in 5 minutes ago, you would have seen Mme Imbert go past with some asparagus twice the size of Mother Calisadu tried to find out from her cook where she got them. You know, you've been serving asparagus with everything this spring, or you might be able to get some like those for our visitors. I shouldn't be surprised if they came from the cures, Françoise would say. I'm sure you wouldn't, my poor Françoise, my aunt would reply, shrugging her shoulders. From the cures, indeed, you know quite well that he never grows anything but wretched little twigs of asparagus. Tell you these ones were as thick as my arm, not your arm, of course, but my poor arm, which has grown so much thinner again this year. Skull? No, I'm Emmy Octave. Ah, my poor girl, your skull must be very thick, you may thank God for that. It was Maguelone come to fetch Drive Piper down. He came out with her at once, and they went off along the Rue de l'Oiseau. There must be some child ill. Oh dear God, Françoise would sigh, for she could not hear of any calamity befalling a person known to her, even in some distant part of the world, without beginning to lament. Françoise, were they tolling the knell for just now? Oh dear. Of course, it would be for Mme Rousseau, and to think that I had forgotten that she passed away the other night. Oh, it's time the good Lord called me to. Oh, don't know what has become of my head since I lost my poor octave, but I'm wasting your time, my good girl. Not at all, Mme Octave. My time is not so precious. The one who made it doesn't charge us for it. I'm just going to see if my fire's going out. Thus Françoise and Maya between them made a critical evaluation in the course of these morning sessions of the earliest events of the day. But sometimes these events assumed so mysterious or so alarming a character that Maya felt she could not wait until it was time for Françoise to come upstairs, and then a formidable and quadruple peal would resound through the house. But, Mme Octave, it's not yet time for your pepsin. Françoise would begin. Are you feeling faint?